Scary Story Collection. 5 Short Scary Stories. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. The Bees. Being a reporter for a local newspaper is a strange occupation. In essence, it's exactly the same as being a reporter for a major news organization. I mean, the actual processes are the same. You find a story, you interview those involved or closest to the story, and then you find a way to present the facts to the public in a factual and, if possible, entertaining way. The practicalities of the task are the same. The difference is the stories. Most stories you cover in the local newspaper are boring. If they weren't, then they wouldn't be in the local newspaper in the first place. They'd be in the nationals. At a major newspaper, stories are like planets. They have satellites. Other smaller stories that circulate around the main thread. In the trade, we call this soft news, the finer detail stories that come with a big piece. For example, when there is some kind of major incident, the hard facts dominate the front page, but page 2 and 3 will cover individual stories of those affected, peripheral stories, joined to or within the orbit of the main story. What is the response of the government to this incident? What incidents like this have occurred in the past? What do celebrities think about this incident, and what do the public think of what they think, and so on? As the days wear on, the soft news pieces become more and more tenuous, only linked by the thinnest thread of relevance, until finally the story has run its course, and the process begins again. In a local paper, however, everything is an irrelevance. The main stories don't have satellites, because they themselves would not even qualify as a peripheral story on a national level. Most stories in local newspapers are exercises in weaving narratives from scraps in an attempt to elevate the mundane and the banal into something almost worth reading. Sometimes, however, even in the tiny, underpopulated corner of the universe, a comet flashes by, a celestial body so large that not only would it make national news, but would change how we think about what is and isn't possible. Then the story becomes too big for even the national papers, because they live in fear of printing anything that might turn out to be misleading or a hoax. These stories have to find other outlets. This story, Arthur's story, is one of those. I first met Arthur Shirk in October of 2015. I'd turned up at his small, terraced house with the intention of interviewing him about his dog, a dog which had apparently been accepted to compete at the prestigious dog show Crufts, a feat which would automatically elevate the talented tail-wagger to the status of single biggest celebrity ever to come out of the town of Wentfield in its entire long and tedious history. The first thing I noticed upon arriving at Arthur's home, however, was the man's worryingly excitable demeanour. He seemed positively ecstatic at the prospect of being able to talk to me, like a prisoner being told moments before he was due at the gallows that he was to be freed on account of there being a national shortage of rope. The second thing I noticed was the conspicuous lack of a dog. Rushing forward before I had even entered the house, he grasped my hands in his own and shook both of them furiously, as if a single conventional handshake would not be sufficient. "Oh, hello, hello!" he exclaimed, pumping my hands jerkily. "I'm so glad you're here, so glad! You'll see in a moment. Please, come inside, come inside!" As he said this, he turned and opened the door into the tiny house, as I wondered what in God's name he was going to surprise me with in place of the clearly fictional dog. As a personal interest piece, Arthur's house in and of itself could have been a double-page feature. A few steps inside revealed him to be dealing with the twin compulsions of being an obsessive hoarder, whilst also being meticulously neat. I had visited the homes of hoarders before. Usually they were foul-smelling places, the entire dwelling swirling with a noxious mixture of mould, dust and dampness. In most, the actual living area was a cramped corner amongst the constructed nest of squalor. Magazines and junk mail dating back decades, yellowing and dried by central heating, would be found stuffed into every crevice, whilst pile upon pile of junk and ephemera was assembled around, covering every possible piece of floor space. In one house I had visited as a rookie reporter, the hoarder, terrified of giving anything away or losing it, had kept for posterity an entire shelf full of mason jars in which he stored every piece of effluence ever to have escaped his body. Row upon row of yellow-brown bottles filled with all manner of filth. As you can imagine, the single and helplessly overwhelmed pine air freshener he had hung from the light bulb did little to help with the smell. Happily, this was not the case with Arthur, and though he had the same enormous piles of rubbish and junk crowding every corner of his room, the piles were arranged in an orderly and pin-neat manner, with each pile being so close to exactly the same height as the others that I suspected a spirit level might have been used to ensure they were the same. The experience of walking into Arthur's back room, then, was like strolling through a miniature city. Skyscrapers made up of notebooks and magazines, clustered together in well-ordered rows, whilst the paths between them, narrow, intersecting corridors like streets, constructed with a level of care that would make a town planner happy, were made up of old suitcases, wooden boxes, and storage files full of plastic toys, hand towels, napkins, and cutlery. As your eyes fell upon each section, you saw a tiny new obsession, a new need to collect and conserve. The space behind one chair contained hundreds upon hundreds of coat hangers, whilst the curtain that covered the back patio window was covered from floor to ceiling with thousands of clothes pegs. I tiptoed cautiously through this garden of detritus, the flotsam and jetsam of modern life, careful not to disturb any of the piles, and followed Arthur's direction to a seat on the left-hand side of the room. The small alcove that Arthur had carved for himself amongst his collection consisted of 2 chairs. One was an incongruously ornate thing that looked for all the world like a throne, whilst in contrast, the other, positioned on the far side of a small table, was a simple wooden folding chair. On the table between us was a kettle, 2 cups, and a beautiful Victorian teapot. Before doing anything else, Arthur poured us both a cup and then sat back on his side of the table as if he were preparing to interview me. Finally, after a long sigh, he spoke with visible relief. "I'm so glad you came," he said, still without revealing why exactly he had contacted the newspaper. Clearly, he felt he had something to share, though having seen the inside of his house, I had to assume that sharing wasn't exactly something he was good at. "I'm sorry about the dog story," he said, with what seemed like genuine sorrow. "I actually did have a real talented dog once. Mummy was going to put her forward for Crufts, but you know how these things are, she just never found the time." As he said this, he gestured to a space behind me, and, turning, I saw a small, framed photograph of a woman in her mid-50s with white straggly hair, beaming into the camera and holding an equally white Yorkshire Terrier in her arms. This, I assumed, was Mummy. On her right cheek, the woman had a distinctive scar the shape of a lemon, which, if I had not known better, I would have said was a bite mark that could easily have been blamed upon the apparently talented, but clearly not quite a tame, terrier. For me, it was only okay for a grown man to use the word mummy if he was talking about Egyptology, and any man in his 40s who still referred to his own mother as mummy set alarm bells ringing in a very Norman Bates kind of way. No sooner had my backside hit the chair than I was already thinking of ways to get out of there. "Okay, Arthur. Unfortunately, I am a rather busy man, so if you wouldn't mind telling me why you asked me here today and why you felt it necessary to lie to us," I began. As soon as I said this, I regretted it. The phrasing was a little bit too harsh, too pointed, and too teacher-like. It sounded as if I was scolding Arthur like a naughty schoolboy for not having done his homework. Arthur visibly recoiled. I'm sorry, I didn't think you'd come. If I told you what I really wanted to talk about, you wouldn't have come, and I need to tell someone." For the first time, I began to feel slightly uneasy about this appointment and just how eager Arthur seemed to bring me there. I considered for a moment how it may have been a mistake not to tell anyone where I was going when I left this afternoon. Still, Arthur was a small-built and far from athletic man. I reasoned that if there was any trouble, I would probably be able to overpower him. Probably. Leaning forward, Arthur poured himself another cup of tea before finally announcing, "I wanted to talk about honey." Though honey was definitely the starting point for Arthur's story and played a central role in it, to say that is all he wanted to talk about is highly misleading. At this point, the reader might be asking why, if Arthur's story is so fascinating, it hasn't adorned the cover of the major national newspapers. Surely the blood-dipped red tops would love this kind of shock and horror tabloid stuff? The answer, quite frankly, is partly due to the incredulity of those publications, their unwillingness to believe me, or by extension Arthur, or to print anything that might prove to be libelous. It is also partly due to a matter of style. The frank listing of the facts one finds in newspapers provides none of the nuance, sense of atmosphere, or impact when recounting events. I chose this model, a true story in the guise of fiction, because it will not only allow Arthur's story to be told without fear of censure, but it will also allow me to give some sense of my own feelings on the matter, and to tell my own tangential story as well. It also helps me to document things that I know to be true, but still can't quite believe. To begin, however, it might be best to hand it over to Arthur. The thing about honey that people don't take into account is how different types of bees produce different types and qualities of honey, especially depending upon what they have been eating. There are hundreds of varieties, sometimes with subtle differences and sometimes with massive differences, so big that the two types don't taste anything alike. For example, if you ever taste a spoonful of good high-grade pine honey, it's got a really rich, earthy flavour, sort of a base of wood behind the sweetness that really lifts it. If you tried floral honey straight after that, honey that tastes almost perfumed, the two things are completely different. You'd think they were entirely different substances. That's not even mentioning the fact that different flowers in different regions can make things taste different. That the time of year can sometimes affect the consistency and colour of the honey. It absolutely baffles me how people can nip to Tesco's or Asda and just pick up honey, like it's just a generic one-size-fits-all product, like buying Coca-Cola or sugar cubes. It's insane. He said this with a wide gesticulation of the arms, which suggested that perhaps that label should be applied a little closer to home. Honey is a serious business. In some countries, you can buy mad honey that sends folks into a state like being drunk or high on drugs. In other places, the honey from particular bees is so expensive that it can literally be considered liquid gold. That's what Mummy always used to call it anyway. Saying this, he glanced lovingly over my shoulder at the framed photograph and smiled. Then, reaching into his pocket, produced another photograph of the same woman and laid it on the table between us. "That's my mummy," he said flatly. "Have a look at the photograph. Really look at it. I want you to remember her face." I lifted the slightly crumpled photograph and looked again at the straggly white hair, blue eyes, and distinctive scar, searching the image for any further significance, before gently placing it back onto the table and beckoning Arthur to continue. Mummy loved honey. Her secret, you see, was that she knew. She knew that the type of bee and where they got their pollen from affected the flavour of the honey. When you see most beekeepers, they have their little wooden hives and then the bees go off wherever to get their pollen. What Mummy did was put these big glass sheets up around our garden. It was mad. It looked like the whole garden was just one massive greenhouse, and I guess, in a way, it was. Because what she did then was surround the hives with extremely specific types of plants, hundreds of them, from all over the world. She was a brilliant gardener as well as my Mummy. Honestly, anything she touched would just bloom, you know, like a natural talent, as if it was in her fingers or something. Having the glass up stopped the bees from going anywhere. Not that they cared, they had all the pollen they could ever want in that one garden, and from all those different varieties. That mix, those influences from loads of different plants all going into the pot, was the secret ingredient. That and the type of bees. You see, having these specific types of plants was part of it, but the other part was having a mix of bee species. To start with, the different types kept to their own hives, but after a while, they interbred, and you started to get these hybrids. Special bees on a special diet. You were always going to get special honey. I sank back in my chair, realizing, or so I thought, that this was going to be a story about his sadly departed mother's special brand of honey, all hopes of anything exciting fading into oblivion as he began to drone on about country fates and rosettes she had won. I realized as he was talking that I was inadvertently tuning him out, already drafting a copy in my head about Wentfield's own prize-winning honeymaker, a short piece that would probably be the star attraction of page 18, and be glanced at momentarily by those who used it to line litter trays all over the village. It was only when Arthur used the phrase, "Britain's best honey," that I snapped back into the room. "Wait, is that official?" I asked, sensing that such an award could push the story into the single-figure pages closer to the cover. I mean, did she actually win an award or something? "Oh yeah," said Arthur, seemingly surprised that I hadn't kept up with the twists and turns of the latest honey-based news. "She was quite famous around here for a while. She was even on the cover of the Sainsbury's Food magazine, and she was on Northwest Tonight. I've still got the video of it somewhere around here." This last statement I didn't doubt for a second. So, she officially made the best honey in Britain, I double-checked, starting to feel glad that I had made the trip. "Well, technically the bees made the honey, but yeah." Arthur trailed off, and for the first time in the conversation seemed to lose the enthusiasm that had poured out of him since he had met me at his front door a half an hour earlier. He stared off into the distance, and seemed for a moment to become emotional, as if choking back tears. After a pause, he apologized and resumed his story. "I'm sorry," he muttered in a low voice. "It's just that if it hadn't been for that stupid award, then none of this would have happened. She wouldn't have met Eli and—" He trailed off. Sitting back in my chair, I reached into my jacket and for the first time took out my notebook and pen, ready to note down Arthur's words. I signalled, as gently as I could, for him to go on, and after a minute, during which he wiped his eyes with his palms in a way that reminded me of a child and cleared his throat, he quietly and cautiously continued. "We were at a big farmer's market. Mummy had a stall, and at the front she'd put these banners she'd made about her award. People came and bought bottles off us, and some people just came to taste it. Mummy had put a few open jars at the front with little squares of bread on toothpicks. The idea was that people could spoon out a little bit of the honey onto the bread and have a taste, like a sample. Now, most people who tried the honey loved it, but then Eli came. I knew he was trouble as soon as I saw him. Something about his eyes. He looked cruel. You know, like someone who would just step over you in the street and not think twice. He clearly had money, because he was dressed all posh in this nice black suit, but I don't know, there was just something about him. Anyway, whereas everyone else would just come up and take a little piece of bread and try the honey, he came over and just stood there, staring at the banner. Not saying anything, just standing there. He waited until everybody else had walked off and then he came over. Mummy was really nice to him, the way she was with everyone. "Would you like to try a sample, sir?" she said, and went to pass him one of the toothpicks, but instead he just looked her right in the eye and then, I'll never forget it, he just picked up a whole jar and stuck 2 fingers into it, his index and his middle finger. Then he just ladled out a massive glob of the stuff and let it slide off the end of his fingers into his mouth like a little golden waterfall. We were both so taken aback we didn't even say anything. Then, once most of it had spilled off, he put the fingers into his mouth and without taking his eyes off us, just sucked them clean. It was such a small thing, but it was horrible. There was real malice in it. Then he just opened his hand and let the bottle fall. It smashed all over the floor, and it wasn't an accident either. He meant for us to see him do it. Then he just took a card out of his pocket and put it on the paste table between us. He said, "Best honey in Britain? I think not." Then he just tapped on the card with those same fingers he'd just pulled out of his mouth. I remember noticing that they were still wet and sticky. "If I were you, I'd remove that claim before it comes back to hurt you." Then he just turned and wandered off. "Was he a competitor?" I asked, surprised by the slightly sinister turn the conversation had taken. "Well," said Arthur, the smile long gone from his lips and seemingly now lost forever. That's the thing. We looked him up later, from the card that he left, but the stuff we read was weird. Weird, I echoed, like a parrot. Weird how? I felt myself becoming genuinely intrigued. Well, he began. Eli Suter sold something called black honey. According to what we could find, this stuff was legendary and had some really odd stuff linked to it. Sensing that I was again about to repeat and prompt, Arthur held up a palm to stop me and indicated that he would tell me in his own time. According to this report we read, Eli had a similar setup to my mummy in that he didn't like his bees roaming. The thing is, his bees didn't mix either. Apparently, he had these weird glass beehives where every bee would be put into its own little honeycomb cell that sealed at one end and had a tiny opening at the other. Rather than letting them fly around, he kept them in these tiny little glass prisons and fed them each individually on God knows what. I mean, I know they're only bees, but still, it's cruel. Anyway, this is all rumour, because you never actually see Eli's hives. They're kept under these thick black sheets, like the kind of thing you'd put over a budgie's cage to convince it that it's nighttime. Now, you'd think that would be really bad for the bees, because they never get the sunlight, but apparently... He paused here and swallowed hard. Apparently, the honey that comes out, it's black, and, well, it's sort of like magic. I closed my notebook. For a while there, this had sounded like an intriguing story, but Arthur had just crossed the line. I had listened to enough crackpots in my time to know that it was all going to be downhill from here. Magic? I said, the naked derision dripping from the ends of each syllable. Well, yeah, Arthur answered, though I didn't find that out until after. After what? I asked, mentally trying to plan my escape from the conversation and route back to the office. After Mummy disappeared, he half-whispered. I reopened my notebook. About a week after the farmer's market, Mummy got a postcard. It was totally black on the front, but on the back, someone had written, "Take it down and renounce, or in 5 days I will be telling the bees." I looked up from my scribblings quizzically and was about to ask before Arthur leapt in to clarify. Telling the bees is an old tradition. Basically, if ever there is a death, or a marriage, or a birth in the household, you need to literally go to the hive and tell the bees about it. If the bees aren't informed or allowed to go into mourning, then it's really bad luck. Sometimes it means they'll leave the hive, or they won't produce honey anymore. It sounds strange, but you can look it up. It's a real thing. I know some superstitious beekeepers who still do it today. I made a note to check this tradition later and tried to clarify the contents of the postcard. Oh, well, Arthur began when I pressed him as to what it meant. It was clearly a threat. Pretty much, stop saying you have the best honey or I'll be telling the bees about you. It's a threat to someone's life. Again, Arthur turned from the conversation to stare into the middle distance. At the time, he said, swallowing hard and, I thought, holding back tears. We took it as a joke. I mean, we knew it was Eli, but, what was he going to do? Arthur fixed his eyes on something I couldn't see, as if watching the entire scenario play out in thin air before him. For a moment, it seemed that he had drifted off, that the room had fallen away, and he had wandered into his own mind. Over and over, almost under his breath, he muttered. What was he going to do? What was he going to do? I coughed loudly, and eventually he snapped out of it, his eyes seeming to refocus as if he had just been woken from a deep sleep or a hypnotic trance. When Mummy went missing, I took that card to the police. At first I thought they'd laugh at me, that they'd think it mad, that some jealous beekeeper could be a threat, but after about half an hour sitting in a waiting room, one of the policemen led me into a small interview room and asked me to sit down. For a second I thought they were going to accuse me of something, but instead, this policeman, Terry his name was, he pulls out his folder and shows me photographs of all these women, and next to the cards, almost exactly the same as the one Mummy had got. Terry said Eli had been a suspect for ages and that they were planning an operation to raid his farm in the next few days. If the card I had given them came back with his fingerprint on it or any other distinguishing mark, then they could bring the raid forward. When I asked Terry what he thought had happened to these women, he sort of dodged the question, but what he did say made my blood go cold. He said that the honey was something to do with black magic, that one small jar of the stuff Eli produced could sell for upwards of £10,000 because there were some lunatics out there who believed that it made them immortal, that as long as they ate enough of the stuff, they would never die or could never be killed or whatever. Terry said, "These kinds of credentials don't come cheap. There has to be some kind of sinister element. There always is with these people. It can't be a coincidence that 12 women that we know of have gone missing, and all of them have received a card from what we assume to be the same man." I thought about Mummy, and for a second I let all sorts of horrible scenarios flash through my mind. When the card came back, it was found to have a single large thumbprint in the centre, a print that belonged to Eli Suter. Within an hour, the police were at Eli's door. I accompanied them to the property, in the hope, they said, that I might be reunited with Mummy, though of course I knew they also thought I might be needed to identify her. As it turned out, the police found neither Eli nor any women or evidence of them at the property. My heart sank, but somehow, in some way, I knew that somewhere on that property I would find my Mummy. So a few hours later, after the police had dropped me off at home with apologies and promised to keep me informed, I went back. It was dusk by the time I arrived at the farm. It didn't take me long to vault the fence and even less time to bust the lock. I walked around the farmhouse cautiously, listening all the while for any signs of life, voices or movement, anything that might give me a clue as to where she was. All I heard was silence, and from outside, the faint, low humming of bees. Looking out into the garden, I saw the hives. Each was around 4 feet tall and had the appearance of a small black igloo, a half globe draped with thick black cloth. I don't mind telling you that in the half-light they looked mightily eerie, like rotten teeth jutting out from the surface of the lawn. I looked about me, knowing that if I was caught there I was likely going to spend the rest of my days behind bars, and that wasn't even considering what might happen if Eli caught me there. Slowly, turning the key, I slid back the glass pane of the patio door and crept outside. Quietly, still listening out for any sound beyond the buzzing coming from the hives, I tiptoed slowly towards them. In the back of my mind, I was already forming horrible images of what might be under the black cloths, images of women bound and gagged, or worse, dead, and rotting beneath the swarm before my eyes. Finally, I reached the first hive, gripped the fabric draped over the top, and with a single wrenching movement, pulled the damned thing off. Arthur paused, leaving as he did a chasm of time between this statement and the expected revelation, the explanation of what lay below. Rather than speaking immediately, however, Arthur reached down to a space below his seat and pulled out a small leather-bound book, which, as he opened it, was revealed to be a photo album. I took the photos on my phone. I had them blown up later and printed. The people who developed them thought I was an artist, that I'd done them as some sort of display piece or project. Can you imagine? Arthur tried to smile, but the momentary raising of his lips only succeeded in producing a horrible, pained expression, somewhere between a grimace and a plea. He handed the album to me. As I flipped through the images, I felt the muscles in my jaw slacken as my mouth hung involuntarily open. Arthur, meanwhile, continued. The glass hive stuff was true. Every one of them was in its own little cell, everyone producing whatever it was they made, but he was no longer talking to me, but to the naked air between us, seemingly to a space a few feet above my head upon which his eyes were fixed. Not that I paid much attention. My own eyes were riveted to the page, to the images, score upon score of images of the things Arthur had found. We thought telling the bees was a normal threat, like he'd hurt you or kill you, so he'd have to tell the bees about it afterwards. But I never expected this. Nobody could have expected this. He was right. From the pages of the album, faces peered out at me, faces of women screaming in agony, their hair fallen in twisted knots across their foreheads and cheeks, their arms clawing ever forwards against the glass walls of their prisons, their chests and backs naked and yet warped as they spilled into the swollen thorax, 4 insectile legs jutting out, 2 from either side and jammed awkwardly against the sides of their cells. Each tiny body was a hideous amalgam that looked like some crudely stitched together sideshow attraction, like the mermaids formed from the top half of a monkey and the bottom of a fish sewn together to fashion some hideous hybrid, half human, half bee. But these were not fakes. Judging by the scale, each tiny insect was around 3 inches long. The hind portion, like that of some enormous hornet, was black and white, striped and bulbous with a prodigious curved sting at the end, whilst the front quarters were those of human beings, writhing in the agony of despair. I stared at Arthur. These aren't real. I mean, they're not them. They can't be real. How can someone do that to someone? How? It's not. Arthur shifted his gaze from the vision he was observing and fixed his eyes on mine. Then, slowly, he leaned across and flipped the page of the album. In the same way that Eli had on the card bearing his name, Arthur tapped on the page. What I saw was another of these hideous creatures, an abomination, neither insect nor primate, but some forged-together monstrosity. In this photo, the creature pushed itself upward awkwardly on its hands, the weight of its behind seeming to drag it ever backward. As I looked closer, however, at the tiny face raised towards the camera, I saw the strands of knotted white hair and the scar high on the cheek. Mummy. "He did it," Arthur hissed quietly. "I don't know how or who he had helped him, but somehow he did this to them." From some other unseen corner, Arthur produced a box of safety matches. The box was around twice the size of a normal matchbox, but in all other aspects was just the same. He placed it on the table between us. Then he burst into tears. As his shoulders rose and fell, as the tears streamed from his eyes, a deep, wounded wailing sound rose from somewhere deep within him. "I didn't know," he cried. "I swear I didn't know. I thought I was helping them, putting them out of their misery." I looked again at the box, then back at Arthur, who was cradling his head in his hands. "It took me hours," he spat, tears and spittle mixing and flying out on the table. "I took them all out, every single one, and smashed them with a hammer. I crushed them because I thought it would help." From inside the box, weak scratching sounds could be heard, as if tiny legs were scraping against the cardboard. "I thought it would kill them, but they'd all tasted it, all eaten bits of that black honey. They couldn't die. They couldn't. But I hit them, all of them, and I crushed them, swatted them like you would a fly. I left them there, just squirming and writhing and broken." Still, the scratching came from the box, louder now, as something within shifted and moved. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know," he wailed. I rose to my feet, eager to get out, to be as far away from Arthur, this house and that box as it was possible to be. I pushed back the chair, spilling a stack of old newspapers as I did, Arthur still sobbing, as, from the box, a tiny, high-pitched buzzing could be heard escaping. I turned and stumbled toward the door, Arthur still screaming his mantra behind me. "I didn't know! I swear I didn't know!" Those words have stayed with me. I heard them in my head long after I'd escaped that house and sprinted down the street. More often than those, however, I hear repeated the tiny, whispered reply. A reply merged with a humming buzz, so high-pitched it was barely audible, spoken as if through water. A voice that, though my back was turned, I know was not Arthur's, and that I know came from inside that box. A voice deep in unending pain, that somehow, wincing as it spoke, still repeated, "I forgive you, Arthur. Mummy forgives you." In 2018, Eli Suter was arrested in Spain for the attempted abduction of a young woman. When the farmhouse he was renting was raided, strange objects were found in his garden. These objects were never thoroughly examined, as someone, allegedly one of the officers involved in the raid, saw fit to set fire to them. The area is now sealed off, though local reports tell of strange humming noises and tiny voices crying out from the ashes. Amongst the documents recovered from the farmhouse was a birth certificate bearing the name Eli Suter. This, however, was judged to be a fake, for if it were genuine, it would make Eli over 170 years old. I never saw Arthur again, but I did send him a letter earlier this year asking for permission to publish his story. He sent me a short note in return, alongside a tiny matchbox that he claimed would provide evidence, if any were needed. I never opened the box. Instead, I threw it into the lake by Fuller's Wood, hoping and praying as I did that whatever was inside was already dead.
The Curse of Abundance. I was going to say that it all started with a toothache, but that's not quite right. It really started the day before, with a decision. A stupid decision made with the sort of offhand nonchalance with which people like me make decisions about places like theirs. It was a bad decision, one that I regret to this day, and one that I probably always will. On the other hand, the decision to go to Greece in the first place had been a good one, though of course that decision wasn't really mine. It had been the run-up to exam season, and as the teacher with the highest number of exam classes in the school, and as a consequence the teacher with the highest number of mock examination papers to mark, by the time the half-term break came around, I was absolutely exhausted. For what seemed like months, I was either in the classroom teaching, planning the lessons I would be teaching the following day, or marking examination papers from one of the 4 exam classes, all of which had multiple papers for me to plough through. I lost count of the times that I had woken up, a stone-cold cup of ridiculously strong coffee beside me, slumped in the early hours of the morning over one badly constructed essay or another, having fallen asleep at my desk at home. Usually, the only thing that stopped me from sleeping right through the night in this position was Bella, my trusty golden retriever, who had herself become restless since her usual long walks on the moors by my home had been severely curtailed by my ridiculous workload. Partly to blame for this push paper mountain was Helen, my faculty head in the English Language and Literature department, who, having had her rather prodigious nose put out of joint by a younger and more dynamic teacher arriving on the scene and overtaking her in terms of popularity, had taken it upon herself to clip my wings by burying me under a mountain of paperwork and giving me the heaviest teaching timetable in the entire school. The other part of the blame lay with me and my stubbornness. I refused to allow this act of sabotage to affect my teaching, and in an effort to carry on to my usual standard, whilst also navigating the myriad pointless tasks I was given by Helen, I was working myself into the ground. A break was exactly what I needed. Luckily, a few days before the end of term, I received a phone call from my friend Claire, telling me that she had booked a week in Greece for the pair of us, and that no was not an option. Claire, who was also a teacher, and in fact the kind of head of faculty I would have loved to work under in the history department, had watched my victimization at the hands of Helen, and had decided to stage an intervention. When I protested her decision to book a holiday without even bothering to ask me, she simply laughed. "I can't go. I've still got a massive pile of mock exam papers to mark, and I haven't even started planning that Shakespeare unit for next term. I don't have the time," I insisted. Claire shook her head. "You get 2 weeks holiday. The papers and the planning will still be there waiting for you in the second week, but to be able to do your students justice, Christ, to do yourself justice, you need a damn break. So for the first week you are coming with me. No ifs and no buts. Unless, of course, those butts happen to belong to particularly attractive Greeks. Then I'll allow it." Claire was impossible to argue with, so I arranged for Bella to stay in the kennel for a week and skulked guiltily out of my apartment, glancing back at the monolithic stacks of paper that stood on my desk like some kind of stationery-based Stonehenge, and reminding myself, they'll be there when I get back. It was only when I arrived at the airport and saw Claire, suitcase in hand and massive grin on her face, that I finally started to forget about them and almost relax a little. As it turned out, the break was exactly what I needed. After a few days of sun, sea, and most of all sleep, I was feeling the best I had in months. The only slight issue was that I knew the sand, surf, and suntan style of holiday was already starting to get to Claire. A restless and curious soul, Claire had never been a fan of simply toasting on a beach. Her mind, it seemed, would not allow her body to stay still for that long in a single stretch, and after a few hours lying in the sun and periodically dipping into the sea, she became fidgety and anxious, wanting, in her words, to do something. By the third day, we had already agreed to separate for the majority of the day, me for a bracing day of reading and relaxing by the pool, and her to a hastily arranged field trip into the mountains to see some of the more interesting historical and religious sites in the area. A typical history teacher. We met up in the evening, and she regaled me with tales of all the fascinating things she had seen, whilst I listened, content to experience these wonders of the region vicariously through her explaining them to me whilst quietly sipping an ouzo and looking forward to another day of sunshine the following day. On the fourth day, however, Claire became insistent that by the end of the week I should join her on one of these excursions, and that if I didn't I would be missing out. Her pitch in convincing me to accompany her was suspiciously tailored to appeal to my personal tastes, but I agreed that on the final day of our stay I would come with her to Lithia. This village, which she had learnt about from one of the waiters at our hotel, was around 40 kilometers from where we were staying, and situated in a small valley. What made the village interesting to tourists, or at least those informed by our waiter — we could not find the place in any tourist guides — was its oasis-like abundance in a region that was not noted for its fertility. Indeed, the whole area, for miles around the village, consisted of the desert-like outcrops of volcanic rock and scrubland, punctuated by only a few sparsely distributed olive trees. Lithia, however, was a town known for its greenery and produce. Like a tiny pocket of fecundity, it was, according to our waiter friend and amateur tour guide, famous for its wine, which was supposed to increase virility in men and bring health and long life to women. "That is the legend. There are a lot of legends around Lithia," he had said with a beaming smile. The promise of myth and history to uncover was more than enough to sell Claire on the place, even before the smile, whereas her rave reviews of the most delicious wine I ever tasted were enough to convince me. As it happened, the village was very pretty and lived up to its reputation. Had Claire not already visited earlier in the week the drive out to the place, which incidentally involved taking 3 different local buses and a taxi that was essentially just the car of a local farmer and was far more effort than I would ever have invested in visiting a remote village, would have convinced me that the place was a myth. Whilst beautiful in its own stark sort of way, the relatively barren mountainsides, scorched by a sky of fierce and seemingly endless blue, did not seem to yield much prospect of decent wine, and for a few moments I did wonder if the place Claire claimed to have visited hadn't in fact been a mirage. When you arrive in Lithia, however, you know you've arrived. The entire small town of whitewashed walls and small narrow streets overflowed with a green abundance that seemed completely out of place in the area. Vines and leaves spilled like the hair of some goddess over every wall. Orchards full of apples and small groves of oranges, lemons, and limes were crammed into every available space. We passed farmers tending sheep in fields with grass so green and juicy with life that I was almost tempted to bend down and try some myself. Instead, I settled for wine. The place that Claire chose for us to sample the local beverage was halfway up a steep hill, itself implausibly covered with fields of parsley and what appeared to be tea, though I was sure that the area did not receive anywhere near enough rain to sustain such a crop. Claire led me to a small, battered-looking farmhouse where an old Greek woman was sitting in the sunshine tending the fire with a large stick. The woman herself looked ancient, which I laughed to myself, at least gave some credence to the idea that the wine blessed drinkers with long life. She wore a strangely ornate garment, the like of which I hadn't seen worn by anyone in the surrounding villages, and had a strange turban-like head wrap on her head. Later, Claire would inform me that in this village, some beliefs and practices still exist that are found nowhere else in Greece. One such practice, which had an exact parallel in the Yao women of southern China, was to only cut their hair once in their lifetime, usually on the occasion of their marriage. In China, the Yao women even keep the length of their hair removed during this single cutting and wind it up with their own, which is often well over 6 feet long, and is worn bound up into their head wraps. This woman, according to Claire, had adopted the same practice, and since she had never married, had over 80 years' worth of growth tied up inside her head wrap. How her neck even supported such a weight was beyond me. The other curious feature of this lady was her jet black lips, painted, I was told, with a special mixture that contained extracts from the surrounding rock and charcoal. The effect was to make her remaining teeth stand out in contrast with a brilliant whiteness rarely seen in women of that age. All of this, though, was simply a precursor to the wine, which I have to admit was among the most delicious I have ever tried, having, as it did, a rich, fruity sweetness that reminded me of pomegranates flavoured with cloves. Having sunk a few helpings of this marvellous stuff, which was served in small copper cups, whilst seated by the fire with the old lady, I was beginning to feel that being dragged away from the pool wasn't so bad after all. Unfortunately, my pleasant consumption in the sunshine was interrupted by Claire's ever-present desire to see and do, and I was torn from my quiet contemplation of the wine's flavour in order to search for a spring, which, according to Claire, was central to some of the mythology in the area. The walk to find this place, based upon very sketchy directions from the old woman, took hours, and by the time we finally reached the place I was not only hot, sweaty and uncomfortable, but thoroughly regretting having had that third cup of wine. Reaching what appeared to be a small grotto, Claire became very excited and began snapping away with her camera whilst I plonked myself down on a rock and took some much-needed swigs of water. The clearing into which we had come was a small recess between two hills. The area had clearly been carved out and flattened for people to cram into the space before it. At the back of this space, carved into the rock itself, was a strange but indistinct statue of around 8 feet in height. It showed what appeared to be a woman wearing a horned helmet. To her left was a lion that she seemed to be not only keeping on a leash, but standing on with one foot. To her right was a pile of large egg-shaped objects, and seated in the corner, a rabbit or a hare. From around the face of this sculpture, in place of what might have been hair, vines spread in all directions, winding up and over the rocks in every direction, coiling over one another and twisting into thick tangles as they moved further away. The effect was quite dazzling. The face and helmet were completely free from foliage. Whether this space was cleared regularly or not, I wasn't sure, but the appearance was that the greenery sprayed out from the face like rays in a child's picture of the sun, or the bright green legs of some great spider. The sculpture was impressive. Whether it was worth the climb, I wasn't sure, though of course Claire certainly seemed to think so. After around half an hour, during which Claire surveyed the entire area and took photographs from what seemed to be every conceivable angle, I was beginning to become bored. I kicked at the ground, ate an orange from one of the nearby trees, and tried in vain to maintain my interest. When another 10 minutes went by, Claire's assurance that she wouldn't be long now began to wear thin, and I contemplated wandering back to the village for another conciliatory cup of the famous wine. As I shifted in my seat, however, a small object by my feet caught my eye. I moved aside the soil with my foot, and after a moment bent down to dig it out. What I found was a small figurine of around 8 inches in length. In some details it resembled closely the statue, but in others it was wildly different. Clearing off the mud with my sleeve, I found that the carving was indeed of a woman, her hands resting on what appeared to be a pregnant belly. What was strange was that the convex protrusion of her belly was joined by 2 more on either side, as if she had 3 separate swellings. Likewise, rather than possessing breasts, the statue had what appeared to be a line of teats on the chest, more like those of a dog, each swollen and full with milk. The face, meanwhile, sported multiple rows of eyes that proceeded upward from the nose in a V shape over the forehead and brow, whilst the hips were unusually wide. To say that it was an attractive sculpture would be untrue, but it was extremely interesting. Emptying a little water from the bottle onto it, I cleaned it up and opened my rucksack to put it inside. As I did, however, a cry came from the far side of the clearing. I looked up to see the lady with the black lipstick staring and pointing at me accusingly. Claire also turned to look at me. How the old woman, who had seemed somewhat unsteady on her feet, had managed not only to keep up with us, but to make it up the mountainside at all, was again beyond me, but she certainly did not seem pleased about it. She jabbed forward with her finger and screeched something at me in a language I didn't understand, but which I also did not think was Greek. Claire scrambled down from where she had been taking photographs and approached the old woman with her open hands raised. The woman, however, continued to point and shout. Clearly, she was upset that I had almost taken the statuette home with me and wanted to lay claim to it for herself. Still seated, I paused with it in my hand and raised it for her to see. This did not help, and instead only caused the pitch and volume of her wailing to increase. I tried motioning toward her, offering to place it in her hands and for her to take it. Still the wailing continued. Eventually, I rose from my seat and gingerly, with exaggerated care and reverence, placed the tiny statue back on the ground where I had found it. Finally, the old woman's noise decreased, and after what I took to be a few sputtered admonishments, she turned and began making her way back down the hill. "What the hell was all that about?" Claire asked blankly. I shrugged, a little hurt and feeling indignant at having been screamed at for doing God knows what wrong. "Are we not supposed to be here or something?" she suggested. "Is it the photographs? Maybe they don't like us snapping the statues." The brunt of the ill feeling had clearly been directed at me, and I had put my camera away a while ago. "Maybe," I said, slinging my rucksack over my shoulder and beginning the trek back down the mountain, trying as best I could to avoid the gaze of the old woman. A few hours later, back at our apartment, I was busy packing to leave early the next day, and decided it would be amusing to play a joke on Claire. Padding barefoot across the marble-tiled floor, her body wrapped in a towel as she dried her hair, she caught sight of the figurine placed coquettishly on her pillow, and froze. She dropped the towel she was using on her hair and turned to me accusingly. "You took it anyway?" she shouted, with little of the humour I had expected my little prank to elicit. I wondered if this was an act, a show of being appalled in response to my having left the thing suggestively on her pillow, and decided to push my luck with the joke. "No, I think it must have followed you home," I said, wiggling my fingers and whistling the Twilight Zone tune to underline the spooky goings-on. Claire snapped at me in a way I wasn't used to. "For fuck's sake, it isn't funny. She was clearly pissed at you for touching the thing in the first place, and then you just stole it?" I was a little taken aback by this and immediately became defensive. "I didn't steal it. I found it. The damn thing was half buried. I had to dig it up like some kind of archaeologist," I said petulantly, though in truth I knew that I had been very secretive when slipping the thing into my rucksack the second time, and had done so simply because I thought it would make an interesting souvenir. "That's not how it works," Claire began, but sensing that I had made a valid point, I pressed my advantage. "That's exactly how it works. Why do you think half the world's archaeological discoveries are in the British Museum? Because it was the Brits who dug them up. Finders keepers." "Are you serious? There are countries crying out for Britain to return stuff. It's literally the definition of stealing," she barked in reply. There was silence, as I stubbornly refused to admit that I had done anything wrong. Well, she isn't going to miss what she didn't know was there, and we're flying at 6 AM, so I won't be going back there to replace it. What's done is done. Case closed, Your Honour. It'll get a nice new home on my mantelpiece. Claire stared for a second, wondering if I was joking, then, silently shaking her head, padded back into the bathroom without saying a word. By 9 AM the following morning, I had completely forgotten about the statue. Having queued for passport control, baggage check and security, and having waited an additional 2 hours for the delayed plane, I was more than preoccupied with my ill will towards the airline to worry about what I'd packed. Claire, too, seemed to have forgiven me for my indiscretion, and during our very rushed and meagre breakfast spent her time reminding me of the many highlights of the short week by the sea. The trip to the village was never mentioned. During the flight itself, I was far too distracted to think about it. I was in agony. I had experienced some problems with my wisdom teeth before, but this was toothache like nothing I had ever known. White, hot electric flashes that shot along the upper jaw on my left side and seemed to grip the hinge as if the bones themselves were trapped in the bite of a pair of pliers that was slowly being twisted. The pain seemed to come in 2 separate parts. At its base was the dull ache that radiated up into the cheekbone, under the eye socket and down into the mouth. Beyond and above that was the sharper, more pressing pain, as the nerve itself seemed to have been set aflame like the fuse to an explosive that, if it went off, might well crack my skull. At one point I thought the pain was going to make me vomit, and I rushed to the tiny cubicle that passes for a bathroom on planes. Spitting into the sink, I saw blood in my saliva and felt a second wave of nausea and decided to overcome my reticence about speaking to strangers and ask the stewardess for some painkillers. She informed me that she was unable to give me any medication because of the possibility that any adverse side effects could then lead to a lawsuit against the airline. Luckily, an old woman sitting in the row behind heard my plea and said that she had some painkillers in her purse that I was welcome to. Lawyers be damned. I thanked her and downed the pills like they contained the antidote. They didn't. The pain continued throughout the flight and the journey home, to the extent that I had not been back in the country for more than 4 hours before I called the emergency dentist and booked an appointment for the following morning. At 4 a.m., unable to sleep because of the pain and I assumed the jet lag, I decided to get up and eat something. Opening the fridge in search of yogurt, the only thing I thought I would be able to manage to eat without chewing and which I thought might have a cooling effect on the nerves, I was stopped in my tracks by a horrendous smell. In the door of the fridge on the top shelf, the eggs, stored in their specially made plastic sockets and purchased only that day, were all broken. A sticky, mucus-like mix of yolk and blood was streaked down the wall of the fridge, whilst from the top of each one a newly hatched chick, bluish-purple, with bulbous red eyes, was draped over the shattered shell, their minute bodies plastered to the shell surface with liquid, each one with its beak gaping open in a tiny, silent scream. I had heard of people warming eggs and chicks hatching from them in a 1 in a million chance, but for all 6 to hatch and inside the fridge? Hatch where the temperature was not high enough for them to survive once hatched, let alone warm enough to stimulate them into breaking through in the first place? It seemed ridiculous. Each egg had seemed perfectly fine when I had placed them in the fridge the previous evening. Retching, I cleaned the mess and wrapped the tiny bodies in kitchen towel and ditched them in the bin. The day to come also held surprises. In the dentist's chair, I told him about my troubles with my wisdom teeth, that the pain was in the same general area, but that it was like nothing I had experienced before. The dentist, a handsome man in his mid-40s, nodded at this and motioned for me to lean back and open up. After a few moments of prodding, he sat back with a puzzled look on his face and informed me that he would need to take an X-ray of the area. I reminded him that my usual dentist had x-rayed the area only a few weeks earlier and asked if there was likely to have been any change in such a short period. The emergency dentist nodded that he understood but insisted on an x-ray. He then wheeled a large piece of equipment into the room, after which he and his assistant left so as not to be exposed to the radiation I was about to be exposed to for the second time in almost as many weeks. He came back in with a puzzled and slightly perturbed look on his face. He flipped the plate up onto the screen and switched on a light so that I could also see the results. What he showed me was my jaw in profile, looking exactly as it had just over a fortnight earlier, but with a significant difference. Above the offending wisdom tooth were multiple white spots of various sizes that spread along the line of my teeth and up toward my cheekbone. Alarmed by these new additions, I pointed to them questioningly. "What are those things?" I asked bluntly. The dentist took a sharp intake of breath and, eyeing me cautiously, announced, "They're teeth. Around a dozen tiny ones. Your previous dentist didn't mention this in your last x-ray?" I sat up from the chair to get a closer look. "Mention it? They weren't there last time. I saw the x-ray," I protested. The dentist glanced knowingly at the dental nurse and then back at me. "With all due respect, even though they aren't mentioned in your records, these growths didn't just spring up in the last 2 weeks. Now, I've seen this kind of thing before, once. One part of the mouth, for whatever reason, decides that rather than simply growing a new tooth, it will grow a collection. You have a whole cluster up there in your jaw on the right-hand side, and eventually they are going to try to come through your gum. Some will stay dormant, but others will begin to sprout if we don't operate." I nodded and agreed to come back for a procedure in a week's time. In the meantime, the dentist pulled my wisdom teeth and gave me enough painkillers to knock out a fairly sizable horse. I thanked him and went on my way. I had taken the bus to the dentist's in anticipation of the fact they might want to give me drugs that would mean I couldn't drive home, but decided that I would walk home and give the pills time to work. By the time I reached home, the pain was just beginning to die down. However, the day's strange events were not finished. Turning into my driveway, I was fishing for my keys when my eyes caught sight of the garden. My hands went limp, and the keys dropped to the floor with a hard metallic clang. The grass in my meagre front garden looked as if it had not been cut in over a year. Hundreds of daffodils, bright yellow and forcing themselves forwards in every direction, crammed into every space not already occupied by stalks of grass that seemed to be sprouting like ears of wheat. How, I wondered, had I strolled past this without having noticed? Surely the pain was not that bad that I wouldn't have seen this. Even so, there was no way that the grass could have grown so much in the week I had been away. It was impossible. Entering the house, I began to wonder if the painkillers given to me by the dentist were affecting me in different ways. I glanced back out of the window to check that I wasn't hallucinating, and called Claire. An hour later, she was at the front door with Bella. Anticipating that I might be unable to drive because of the drugs, I had asked Claire to pick her up from the kennels. Dropping her off, Claire looked with a worried glance at the garden as if it was somehow indicative of me having let myself go due to overwork. I asked her to come in and explained that only a few weeks earlier I had paid a neighbour's son a tenner to cut it for me. "But that's impossible. There's no way." I shrugged and stroked Bella's head as she licked my hand. "Everything is impossible until it happens, I guess." I told her about my teeth and about the weird incident with the hatching chicks. Claire turned white. "What did you do with the statue?" I eyed her suspiciously, hoping against hope that she wasn't going to blame the strange occurrences on me having stolen the artifact from Greece. "Oh, for Christ's sake, Claire, I'm sorry. I'll donate it to a museum or something. Can you not just let it drop?" Claire was stone-faced, her lips pressed together tightly, and for a few moments she sat in silence. Then, as if deciding suddenly to take the plunge and tell me what was on her mind, she began to speak. "When I got home last night, I decided to do some research about Lithia and that statue. Not just because I'm sad and have no life, but I was going to put the photos on Instagram, and if I mislabeled it, then you just know one of the smartasses in my department would be on it within seconds, calling me out for not knowing who it was meant to be." I nodded, more to indicate that I understood why she was looking it up than because I knew why she was bringing it up now. "Anyway, I couldn't find anything on the village at all. It must be one of those things that only the locals know about, that hasn't quite made it into the Lonely Planet guide yet." I nodded, reflecting that if she was putting it on Instagram, then it wasn't likely to stay that way for very long. I put in some other search terms, but the only thing I could find about the place was one mention of a weird little village on one of the travel forums. This guy talked about an 80-year-old woman who had never cut her hair and wore black lipstick. I nodded. That certainly sounded like my shouty friend from the village with the starey eyes and pointy fingers. "Her name is Mother Lana, and according to this guy, she's famous in the local area." I nodded again. Well, she isn't someone you'd forget in a hurry. Claire did her best to raise a smile, but it faded far too quickly to be genuine. The Post said that if she was more well-known, she'd be in the Guinness Book of Records. She's 86 now, and according to people in the surrounding villages, she had her last child at the age of 74. I snorted at this, a derisory sound meant to stand in for a genuine laugh. Well, that's bullshit for a start, I said. Plus, I thought she'd never been married. Who is she, this Virgin Mary? This time, Claire did not even attempt to smile. It gets worse. According to this guy, she had her first child at 16 and was pregnant every year after that until she was in her 70s. There are 97 other people living in that village, all male and all her sons. I stared at Claire, trying to assess exactly how much of this horseshit she was taking in. Her face was leaden and gave nothing away. If she was joking, then she had a hell of a poker face. You remember seeing any women when we were there, other than the old woman? I thought about the trip, the men tilling the fields, working in the orchards and picking fruit. At the time, I suppose I'd assumed that it was just a sexism thing, that the men worked in the fields whilst the women stayed at home with the kids. I also considered that this attempt to spin a myth could have been backwards engineered. The story about there only being men having been invented because the dude only saw men when he visited. Before I could suggest this, however, Claire had already moved on. Anyway, I did some research on the statue itself and... She paused and stared directly into my eyes with a look of genuine concern. And the one that you brought home with you. It turns out that Lithia is actually the name of fertility goddess in Greek myth, but not one who looks anything like the statues. I did some reading, and the closest thing I could find to the carving in the wall is Inanna. She's usually depicted with a horned helmet, standing on a lion and with wings. I nodded. That sounded about right and quite similar to what we saw. Thing is, Inanna was a Sumerian god. She was worshipped later by the Akkadians and Babylonians, but that was thousands of miles from Greece. It doesn't make sense. Then there's the eggs and the rabbit. They're associated with Ishtar, another Babylonian goddess, also a fertility symbol. She's the reason we have eggs and rabbits at Easter to show fertility. I frowned in what I hoped was a quizzical look. I thought Easter was about Christianity. I'm sure someone told me that once, I interjected. Claire raised her hands in a motion that said both "don't get me started on that topic" and "don't interrupt me on this one" in a single movement. The thing is, that's another goddess, another fertility symbol. It makes sense that they would worship fertility gods in a place like that village, but to have elements of so many different gods in one place, so far from where they are actually part of the mythology, makes no sense. So what about my little friend? I said, referring to the statue that was lying in my rucksack beside the bed. The flippancy of the comment didn't sit well with Claire. That one I couldn't identify at all, but multiple pregnant bellies, multiple teats, and all those eyes? I'd say that has to be a fertility symbol of some sort. I nodded. The logic definitely made sense. What I did find was that people would bury figurines of local gods in these areas as an offering to make the ground fertile. In Lithia it clearly worked, or at least people think it did. That's probably why the woman was so pissed at you for digging it up. I sighed deeply and admittedly did start to feel a little guilty. What worries me, though, is that you took it away, Claire said with a sense of disappointed finality. I moved toward the kettle and, sighing to indicate my weariness with the subject, laid out 2 cups for tea. Claire, however, ignored the sighs and continued. What if it worked under the soil, but it works differently here? What if all this weird shit, all this abundance and fecundity is, well, fertility gone wrong? At this, I burst out laughing. I have a feeling that given the chance, Claire would have become angry at me. As it turned out, she didn't have the chance, as we were both interrupted by a hard, wet slap as Bella's head ricocheted off the floor. I had never seen a dog faint before, and I must admit I panicked. Leaping to her side, I simply shouted at her over and over in a bid to rouse her. Claire, on the other hand, was far more level-headed. She bundled Bella up and rushed her to the car. 20 minutes later, we were at the vet, Claire having called them on the way whilst I sat in the back and continued to panic. After taking her directly into the back, the vet asked us to take a seat, and for over an hour we waited patiently for news. When he re-emerged, the vet at first looked stern, but eventually broke into a smile. "She's going to be fine. Unfortunately, we did have to operate and she won't be up and around for a while." I stepped toward him eagerly, and after thanking him repeatedly for several minutes, finally got around to asking the question. What was it? I mean, what was actually wrong with her? Here, the vet became a little sheepish and shook his head. "Well, in the first instance, the answer is pregnancy." I shook my head. I tried to explain that Bella hadn't been near a male dog long enough for that to happen, except perhaps at the kennels, and even then she'd been done. She was incapable of having pups. It was then the vet's turn to shake his head. Quite the contrary. He led us into a small room beside the waiting room and switched on a backlit screen. I had a feeling of déjà vu as an X-ray jumped into life. It was Bella, or at least her stomach ribs and spine, below which there was what appeared to be a mangle of tiny bones. I stared at the image, then at the vet. "I've never seen anything like it. Not only was Bella pregnant, she was pregnant with over 35 individual pups. She hadn't begun to show because they were still in the early stages, but, well, if you had not brought her in when you did," he trailed off before adding, "she would not have survived the pregnancy." I was stunned. Later that night, Claire and I took the tiny statue up onto the moors and buried it. It probably won't surprise you to learn that the place we buried it has become something of a tourist attraction, and there's now a whole legend about the magical orange tree that seemed to appear overnight, and somehow, in defiance of all logic, manages to grow and bear fruit on the moors in northwest England. I've never been back to that place and hoped, as we both did, that this burial and the tree would be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Around a month later, as I left the house on my way to town, I met my neighbour Tim coming in the opposite direction. His face was ashen. When I waved, he burst into tears. I walked over to comfort him and invited him inside to sit down for a moment and collect himself. After a few minutes, during which time I prepared tea, he managed to explain the cause of his outburst. His wife, my neighbour Marie, had died the previous night. She had passed away due to complications around her pregnancy. The doctors had told us already that she was pregnant with triplets. We thought it was triplets, but then she got so big, just so big. When we went to the hospital and they did the ultrasound, we thought it was triplets, but... I stopped Tim at that point, placing my hand on his, partly to reassure him and save him from having to go through the whole thing again, and partly because I already knew what he was going to say. The Little People. I've always believed the old maxim that truth is stranger than fiction. If you ever doubt the fact, then I urge you to spend more time around people, particularly the elderly, and to make sure that you spend that time listening. One of the best things about working in care with the elderly is the never-ending procession of stories. It's a perk of a job. Lived experience is the best source for narratives, and once you get to know those that you care for, and more importantly, once they get to know you, you often find that they are more than willing to reminisce about their past experiences, the lives they've lived, the people they've loved and lost, and to talk about the strange twists of fate that have befallen them. Sometimes, however, it pays to be careful. For although truth is undoubtedly stranger than fiction, it can also be far more terrifying. Sometimes the things people tell you with a straight face and absolute conviction can rob you of your sleep. For the first few weeks I spent with Lawrence Tivers, I thought of him as just another client.
At 94, he was a frail and wizened little man who spent most of his time hunched in his chair in a way that always reminded me of a beetle or some other insect, its front legs folded before it in the same draped fashion in which Tivers held his arms. It wasn't just his posture either. In his quick, jerky movements and nervous, furtive glances, too, there was something distinctly insectile about the man. Mostly, however, I suppressed these impressions and instead simply went about my duties, retaining a cheery disposition and always greeting Lawrence with a smile. For that first month, every day was pretty much the same. First, I would tidy around his small apartment whilst he muttered instructions and admonishments, pointing every now and then with a bony finger at some object or corner of the room he felt had not been cleaned to his satisfaction. Then it was time to clean him, helping him with considerable difficulty into the walk-in shower and helping him bathe, noting as I did that his complaints about corners and crevices not being sufficiently cleaned evaporated when it came to his own person. I had been working as a carer for almost 7 years when Lawrence became one of my clients. Every day I would stop in on him, and in addition to my cleaning duties, both of him and his home, I also prepared meals and changed linen to ensure that he was well looked after and comfortable, and usually spent a few hours with him just keeping him company. Though he had muttered his instructions and protestations from day one, it took 4 weeks before he spoke to me properly, and even then it was with a scolding tone. To my surprise, rather than the feeble murmurings he had made in my first visits, Lawrence was suddenly forthright, entirely composed, and spoke with great clarity and vigour, albeit with a certain pointed sharpness to his tongue. I did, of course, wonder why he waited so long to show his verbal capabilities, why he had decided almost to play a role, acting the part of someone far more infirm upstairs than he clearly was, and why in the end he had decided to reveal his true character to me. According to him, it came down to 2 things. The first was trust. In my 4 weeks on the job, I had tried, as I did with all of my clients, to grant Lawrence as much dignity as I could. I refused to patronize him and followed what few instructions he gave to the letter. After all, whilst I was his carer, I was also a guest in his home, and as such I felt I should treat him and his home with respect. Lawrence had clearly wanted to see how I would act in his company without prompting, how I might treat him in the event that he was mentally diminished. He therefore decided to act the part almost as a test I had passed, despite not knowing it was taking place. Despite his grumbling, Lawrence appreciated the way I treated him greatly. His second reason for revealing his true capabilities was, I believe, frustration. Whilst I tried always not to condescend to my clients, I had found it necessary in most cases to speak more slowly and loudly when addressing them, and though I did not alter the content of my words, this process annoyed Lawrence immensely. Eventually, he was forced to reveal his true capacity out of sheer annoyance. "For God's sake," he spluttered one day in an unexpected paroxysm that I'll admit startled me at the time. "I'm old, not stupid. Why do people always insist on talking to the elderly as if they are in play school? And why do you keep speaking so slowly? For Christ's sake, man, spit it out. I don't have long left on this earth. The last thing I need is people slowing down their speech and using up what precious time I have left, taking 30 minutes to say something they could have said in 10. I turned and smiled at Lawrence. "Well, if it isn't the real Mr. Tivers. Pleased to meet you, sir. Not sure who I've been looking after for the last 4 weeks, but this new character seems awfully grumpy about it." Lawrence leaned back and pointed at me with the finger he seemed to reserve solely for the purpose of admonishing people. I noticed that as he sat back in the chair, his body seemed to unfurl, and he no longer hunched forward in the way that he had on my previous visits. Even that, it seemed, had been part of the act. "Don't be a facetious boy. I needed to know I could trust you before I spoke to you properly." I again smiled. "Well, I'm glad to have passed the test. Anything in particular you wanted to share with me now that I'm part of the circle of trust?" I asked. Lawrence raised his head, and there was a long pause whilst he seemed to consider. Then finally he said, "Yes, there is. Tomorrow." Despite my questions and cajoling, he did not say another word for the rest of the day. When I arrived at Lawrence's house the following day, I greeted him in the usual way, and again, as usual, breezed past him toward the kitchen in order to collect the cleaning products I would need, and to make a start on tidying the place. Before I could reach the door of the kitchen, however, Lawrence called out, "Leave that. Come here and sit down." He said this more as a command than an offer. "I will in a bit, but I need to get started on the—" Lawrence shifted around in his chair to look at me and rudely interrupted. "I said leave it. I've managed to hang on for 94 years. I don't think a few dirty dishes are going to see me off. Now come in here and sit." Putting down my bag and smiling to myself, I did as I was told, and plonked myself into an armchair opposite Lawrence. It was at this point that I noticed the collection of documents and folders spread across the coffee table before him. They had not been there the day before, or indeed any other day that I had visited, and in fact, despite having cleaned the house from top to bottom, I had never seen them before. This meant that either someone had brought them to the house, or Lawrence had been hiding them away somewhere within the house, some secret cubbyhole from which he had only now retrieved them. Before I could question him about the books, Lawrence surprised me yet again by reaching into the pocket of his knitted cardigan and pulling out a mobile phone, which he then proceeded to tap and swipe with surprising dexterity. Most of the people I worked with were baffled by modern technology, and I had spent many hours tuning in satellite television and explaining how iPods, purchased by well-meaning grandchildren, actually worked. I had even caught one lovely old dear holding it to her ear like a telephone, expecting the sound to come out of it. Lawrence, however, not only understood how to use the mobile phone, but, as I was about to find out, had been using it for quite some time. "I looked you up, you know, before you were assigned to me as my carer. I did a check and found out a little about you and what makes you tick." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. The idea that Lawrence had done a background check with what little information he could gather from the internet surprised me. That he was driven to and indeed capable of doing so surprised me even more. "Learn anything valuable? I think I've deleted most of the embarrassing stuff, to be fair." Lawrence, for the first time in a month, smiled. "You write horror stories, don't you, Sonny Jim?" At this, I must admit I was a little taken aback. It was not something I talked about on social media, and though a few of my stories had my real name attached, it would take some considerable digging and trawling through pages to link them directly to me. In response, I simply nodded. "Good. Some of them aren't bad, you know. Your stories. Of course, some are downright terrible, but—" He trailed off, and leaning forward lifted a heavy-looking leather-bound document wallet from the table. "Many years ago," he began, opening the folder with some ceremony, as if he were a storyteller in some child's book of fairy tales, and had a crowd of eager children huddled around his knees. "And many times since," he continued, "I have tried to publish my findings in respected academic journals, to tell those hacks in the anthropology and archaeology departments about what I saw, but they won't listen. They never listen." I nodded in feigned agreement, though I had no idea where he was going with this. "You, on the other hand, you have a ready-made audience, people who read your stories and comment or discuss them, people who will hear what you have to say." Here, he again extended that bony, admonishing finger like a wand, though this time it was used for the sake of emphasis. "I'm going to tell you something. I want you to write it as one of your horror stories and get it out into the world, but I also want you to tell them that it's true. Will you do that?" I leaned back in the chair and looked the old man up and down. It was an interesting proposition. "Well, that depends," I said with no small amount of mischief. "On what?" he balked, gripping the arms of his chair and jerking suddenly forward in anger. "On the story," I concluded flatly. This is the story he told me. Whether the story itself is true, I cannot guarantee. What I can tell you with absolute honesty is that everything I have written so far is true, and that when Lawrence told me the story and showed me his photographs, he believed it. So did I. What follows is as close an account as I can produce of the story Lawrence Tivers told me that day. The story that he was aching to share with the world, and which he believed had been suppressed by those within the academic community for fear that it might challenge the accepted order or, indeed, upset and horrify people. I have attempted in the writing to capture the way in which he told it, and have put it in Lawrence's words. I have changed one or two names, but the locations and most of the assertions he makes about biology check out. Whether you believe the rest is up to you.
It always astounds me, Lawrence began, how little the average man in the street knows about himself. I hear all the time scientists on the television talking about how superior humanity is, lauding our achievements and talking about how we put a man on the moon and that one day we will master space travel. Well, I always think, that's all well and good, but these projects reaching for the stars are looking through the wrong end of the telescope, built on foundations of sand. We as a species should not even think of looking toward the heavens until we understand the clay from which we are formed, until we have even the foggiest notion of where we came from and who we are. When Darwin wrote about the origin of species, he was writing about how species plural developed. No one to this day has ever written on the origin of our species, because not a soul knows. Ask the average man in the street to give an estimate of how old he thinks our species is, how long we have been around as Homo sapiens sapiens, and most will give an answer in the millions of years. When you tell them that modern humans are only around 300,000 years old, they are shocked and disbelieving. Tell them that at one time there were multiple hominin species roaming the earth at the same time, and they think you mad. We, Homo sapiens, are the only extant hominids today, but at one time several subspecies populated specific areas of the planet, including stronger and larger varieties like Homo neanderthalis, the Neanderthals as we call them, and smaller, almost hobbit-like species like Homo floresiensis that stood only a metre in height. I mention this because I am of the belief that whilst it may sound far-fetched, some of these species still exist today. I believe this because I have seen them. I know that they exist. I also know the reason that people don't want to talk about it. In 1960, I led an expedition funded by the British Museum into the interior of a remote region of Papua New Guinea. The purpose of the expedition was twofold: exploration with topographical evaluation, and the acquisition of zoological specimens for the museum's archives. It is hard to believe now in the era of Google Maps, when any idiot with a telephone or computer can zoom in on an aerial view of any square of the planet, but in 1960 there were still blank spaces on the map, areas that had never been entirely explored and never properly mapped or documented. It might interest you to know that even today, Google or no Google, there are areas of Papua New Guinea that are still unexplored. Entire ecosystems that are virtually untouched by humanity, and populations thought to exist that have never had contact with the outside world. There is still some mystery left on the Earth. Despite the relative mystery and sense of adventure inherent in such a trip, I'll admit that up until a week before I set out on the expedition, I felt as if I had some notion of what to expect. I had spent time in Indonesia before and had led multiple expeditions in similar terrain for similar purposes. What I didn't expect was the meeting with Clive Lamy 2 days before I set off, and the impact that meeting would have on my thinking about the whole project. I had known Clive for almost 10 years by that point, and had always known him to be a straight-shooting and level-headed sort of chap. That night, however, he seemed nervous and jittery. He had asked to see me the previous day and had stressed with some seriousness in his tone that I should tell nobody that I was coming to see him. He clutched my arm tightly as he said this in a way that made me think of those spy movies where people skulk around in doorways and whisper to each other in clandestine codes whilst they cast long creeping shadows up the walls. At first I thought perhaps it was some sort of jape, a prank intended to unsettle me before I set off on my way, but something about the way he gripped my arm, the desperation in the gesture, made me believe that it wasn't. When I did finally meet with him the following evening, Clive was nothing like the man I had known previously. Now he seemed nervous and somehow small, shifting always in tiny secretive movements as if physically huddling himself around a secret that he held somewhere within himself. When he spoke to me, his eyes would constantly dart around the room, looking over my shoulder toward the door as if always expecting someone to interrupt or step out of the shadows and catch us in the middle of some top-secret negotiations or wicked plot. The overall impression I got from Clive was one of deep paranoia. At first I tried to laugh off this impression, but as the meeting wore on and he approached the true reason for summoning me to his laboratory at such a strange hour, his agitation increased to such an extent that I felt forced to mention it. "I say, old boy, are you okay? You don't seem quite yourself at the moment." At first Clive didn't respond, but instead rose from his chair and moved to the door of the laboratory, locked and double-bolted it, checking the fastenings several times before he returned to his seat. To say that I wasn't at all unnerved by his behaviour would be a lie. Something had clearly upset him and made him deeply nervous. That he seemed about to share whatever it was with me was, I admit, a little unsettling. Moving silently around me, Clive opened a large sliding drawer in one of the cabinets he kept in the room and carefully pulled out a tray with a piece of blue surgical cloth draped over it. There was a lump under this cloth, which I assumed to be an animal specimen of some kind. With some considerable difficulty, struggling with the weight so that I had to help him, he placed it upon a desk in the centre of the room. "Okay," Clive said finally. "I'm going to show you this because I know where you are headed. I have mentioned this to 2 other people at the museum already. One told me to seek medical attention, and indeed reported my worrying mental condition to members of the board, whilst the other told me if I didn't drop the topic entirely I would find myself out of a job. In the past 3 weeks this laboratory has been broken into 4 times by people who had obviously gotten wind of my reports, and decided that they needed to acquire the samples for themselves. There was even a break-in at my home. They came looking for it at my home." As he said this, his eyes widened with what seemed like a mixture of fear and astonishment. "Luckily, I had stored the specimen off-site in a warehouse nearby," he said whilst moving around to the other side of the table and taking hold of the cloth covering the sample. "There are people who don't want you to see this," he whispered quietly. "If they find it, they will destroy it, because it goes against everything they think they know. I wanted to show it to you because you're going where it came from, because if you know about it, you might be able to bring more back." With that, he lifted the sheet. At first glance, I simply smiled. It had been a joke. All that build-up for this? In the tray was a coiled-up snake, a python by the looks of things, and whilst it was a fairly large specimen, it was nothing to write home about. "It's a snake. I imagine I'll be seeing quite a few of these fellows whilst I'm out there. I'll be sure to bring a few back." I laughed, but Clive did not share in the mirth. Instead, he opened his desk and presented me with a small paper folder. "And what's this? Orders for 20 pairs of snakeskin shoes?" I chuckled and flipped open the folder with a smile and stared at the contents. After a few seconds, I saw why Clive had been so secretive. "This is a scrub python," he announced in a flat monotone. "It is the largest species of snake in Papua, but not a particularly large specimen. I was asked to prepare this one for taxidermy, but when it arrived I noticed that there was a large protrusion in the snake's midsection, indicating that it had eaten only a few hours before it met its end. I decided that it might make an interesting exhibit piece if, rather than simply stuffing the poor thing, we could make a cross-section of the carcass showing the animal's prey inside its belly.
To that end, I went to the trouble of having the thing X-rayed to see exactly what it had been feeding on.
I glared at the photograph, back at Clive, and then once again at the image. The folder contained an X-ray plate showing a portion of the snake. At the top of the image was the thing's spine, and below, hanging like the pointed teeth of an immense comb, were its tiny, slender ribs. Shadowy masses of grey indicated where the thing's organs resided, and there, directly in the centre of the image, nestled below the ribs and encased with the elastic leather of the snake's skin, was the skeleton of a tiny man. At first I wondered if it might be a rat or mouse that had become malformed or misshapen through having been consumed by the serpent, but a second look confirmed my first impression. It was a man, or at least a human being. The corpse could not have been any more than 5 inches tall, yet the shape of the skull and the proportions showed that it was not an infant, but a fully grown individual, an implausibly tiny human being that had fallen foul of the snake. I gasped at the image in disbelief. It should be remembered that the Homo florensis, the tiny hobbit-like human I mentioned earlier, was not discovered until 2003, and when it was, a prominent doctor stole the skeleton and only returned it years later with considerable damage because it disproved his theories. That was in the 21st century. In the 1960s, the idea that even an ancient species related to humans could be so small was considered absurd. That a subspecies of human, a tenth of the size, could still be alive was unimaginable.
If these things are out there, Clive said, still alive and being fed upon by the local fauna, it would change our entire understanding of our origins and of how our species evolved. That's why some people are keen to destroy it. I'm telling you about it for 2 reasons. Firstly, because I know you're going there, and if it is in your power to bring one of these things back, alive or dead, then for God's sake you must. You hear me, Lawrence? You must.
With that, Clive moved from the table on which the specimen lay around to the other side of his desk, where he put himself heavily into the chair.
The other reason is because long before I saw this specimen, I had heard about these things. Not as a species, but as a myth. The first time I myself went to Papua, I saw an image carved into a tree of a normal-sized man surrounded by around a dozen of these tiny humans. At the time I took it to be some local folk superstition, and the day before I left I pointed to it and asked some of the villagers about it. The way they reacted has stayed with me ever since. One threw his hands up with a screech and ran away. Another explained through a translator that it is forbidden to point at the image or refer to it within the confines of the village. The villagers are forbidden to speak about them. When I tried to get my translator to press them about who they were, the others obediently refused to speak. But one, with his eyes fixed on me, unblinking, did raise his hand to a C-like shape, then closed and opened it slowly, over and over. I turned to my translator, who, looking deeply disturbed, pointed to his mouth. The hand motion was meant to convey something about these creatures, the hand used to signify a mouth, the fingers, teeth, and the opening and closing the act of chewing. I looked again at the carving, the crudely drawn man surrounded by the tiny figures, and realized the tiny humans were not simply standing by the taller figure, they were hunting it.
Needless to say, I took this warning seriously and carried it with me during my expedition. For the first week or 2 in Papua New Guinea, I attempted to put the idea out of my mind. Camped on the outskirts of the forests with villagers that were accustomed to visits from outsiders, I felt both welcome and safe. My translator helped me to communicate easily with those members of the community who did not speak English, and it was not long before I had built a close rapport with many of them, spending my nights around the campfire making jokes as we compared notes on our very different ways of living. The entire experience was incredibly pleasant. After a week of preparations, however, it was time to set off into the less well-explored areas of the jungle, and it was at that point that my apprehension began to increase. We set off on an easterly course toward a barely explored area known as Star Mountain. The trip towards this edifice would take around a fortnight, chopping and trekking through thick vegetation. Around a week into the journey, we would stop off in the village of a tribe known to my guide, who, though their dialect differed massively from that spoken on the edge of the forest, Papua being one of the most culturally diverse places on Earth, were able to understand some of what he said and were generally welcoming to outsiders, particularly if they came bearing gifts. I don't mind admitting that during that 7 days, I thought often about that tiny skeleton and the carving my friend had described. Once, in the early hours of the morning, I was roused from my sleep by the sounds of rustling and what sounded to me like tiny whispers somewhere outside my tent. I lay very still and, turning on my torch, watched the canvas sides against which I lay, waiting for shadows to be projected against the wall of the tent. What would I do, I asked myself, if I were to see the silhouette of a figure, perfect in proportion but only inches tall, creeping slowly towards me? Of course, I did not see it. All I saw were blades of grass and forest vegetation moving slightly in the breeze, though in my mind's eye I constantly saw that huddle of tiny, scurrying silhouettes, miniature men, naked and hunched, skittering through the underbrush and searching greedily for food, their tiny, sharpened teeth craving to scrape from the bone any meat they could find on the forest floor, a floor upon which I now lay. Would it be possible, I wondered, for a subset of our kind to hunt other men? To attack, bring down and consume their larger counterparts, viewing them in the same way that primitive man viewed mammoths, as a large but conquerable source of protein? I recalled over and over footage I had seen of piranha in the Amazon, of how a chicken dropped into the waters would be stripped of its flesh in seconds as a swarm of tiny mouths sporting dagger-like teeth tore in a frenzy at the meat, a milieu of minuscule jaws squirming and writhing over each other, each clamouring forwards for purchase, fastening their mouths on anything they could find and tearing hunks of meat from the whole until, finally, after only a few brief seconds, a bare skeleton was all that remained. A skeleton like the one I had seen, that proved beyond doubt that these were not simple folk stories, but hard, biting realities. Again, I listened for the sounds of tiny, scurrying feet circling around the tent, and though they never came, I hardly slept at all. A few days later, arriving in the village, we greeted our hosts with gifts of chocolate, tobacco, and soap. After some ceremonial greetings that needed to be navigated with care, we were welcomed into the village and introduced to the chief. Taking the opportunity to regain our strength after several days trekking, we spent several nights in the village and, again, despite the language barriers, I felt that after a short time eating, sleeping and conversing with these people, that I had established a warm relationship with them. So comfortable did I feel in their presence that on the 4th day I decided to push my luck and question them about the presence of tiny men. To do this, I used a copy of a photograph given to me by Clive of the tree in another village, the one that showed the image of a normal-sized man pursued by tiny hunters. The effect of this image on the assembled villagers could not have been more startling. They became suddenly hushed, all eyes turning towards the chief, who himself remained steadfastly silent before finally rising from his seat and disappearing into his dwelling, signalling an end to the proceedings. That night, I was informed by my guide that we would need to move on the following morning, 2 days earlier than planned, and though no specific details were given, it was fairly clear that my questioning had been the cause of some upset within the tribe. The following day, we did as requested, and though we tried to be pleasant and the atmosphere never approached being hostile, there was undoubtedly a change in my hosts. Something had been said that should not have been mentioned, and though they remained polite, there was a sense of deep offence having been taken. I tried several times to apologise, but it seemed to do no good, and so instead we set off on our course, hoping that one day we might be able to return to the village and mend some bridges. As it happened, our return was far sooner than we had planned. Having headed out into the forest and travelled for a day, we were met by a large and seemingly impassable river. To make matters worse, as we planned possible means of crossing or rearranging our route to attempt a crossing at some other point, The heavens opened. The deluge persisted for hours, and early the following morning it became clear that our stay in that area was going to present considerable risk to life. The river was close to bursting its banks, and if it did so, it would take our hastily assembled camp and us with it. The only option was to retreat. With heavy hearts and some trepidation, we headed back to the village. It was upon entering the village for the second time that I first saw one of the little people. Some, of course, will have already dismissed my story as nonsense, and having been brought up on tales of Tarzan and boys' own comics about explorers, will expect some swashbuckling tale of how I and my companions fought off an attack from these creatures. The truth is, however, as always, darker and far more grim. For the first time I ever saw the intact body of one of them, it was back in the village. I caught sight of it as we approached, and realized instantly that the chief knew I had seen it, that I had noticed its grey-brown skin, its entire form no more than 7 inches, the perfectly sculpted human features, indistinguishable from ours except for being produced in miniature, every detail the same. He knew that I'd seen it, and that I'd watched as its leg flopped, slack, gelatinous and limp, pulled by the force of gravity, to rest over the flame. Seeing that I saw, the chief said nothing, and instead only smiled as he turned the tiny body roasting on the spit.
The harm I've done. The first time I took revenge on Malcolm Peters, I have to admit, I regretted it. Not that he didn't deserve it, you understand. There was definitely justification for what I did, but somehow it felt awkward, staining, and wrong. It wasn't even really about him, or any concern for how my actions would have affected him. Rather, it was more about me, the way that taking those actions made me feel. That first time, the pleasure in revenge was momentary, and pretty soon I began to feel regret at having debased myself, allowing myself to be dragged down to that level. There had been enough of that sort of thing in our family already. The second time, the final time, I felt no remorse. What happened, happened. Nothing can be done about it now, and of course there is no way to prove that I or Chaco had anything to do with it. I first met Peters in the summer, and under the most unglamorous of circumstances. Taking the job at the burger joint hadn't really been a choice, but a necessity. It's funny, but even now I remember as a kid visiting the place and watching the staff. Teenagers sprinting from one task to another whilst disgruntled customers on the other side of the counter screamed at them. I remember thinking that I would hate to do that job, to spend my days caked in grease and sweat. A speckling of tiny fat burns lining my forearms from where the burgers or the fryers had spat and seared the skin. I remember thinking that I would hate to be forced by the requirements of my job to take that abuse from customers. To turn back to their foul-mouthed tirades at the close of an 8-hour shift and smile falsely, wishing my tormentor a nice day and wishing him to come again, even though I really wish they'd never visit again in their life. Even as a child, I recognized hard work and understood injustice. What I did not have a firm grip on was economics, and how in years to come a lack of funds would force me to don one of those hideous uniforms and learn to smile politely whilst also biting my tongue. They say that money is the root of all evil. If that were really true, then my mother and I would be saints by now, as we spent most of my childhood in appalling poverty. When a parent died in the books I read at the local library, the son or daughter always inherited a fortune. Relatives were always dropping dead and providing the protagonists with unexpected windfalls in the form of property or riches. All of my grandparents and uncles were back in the old country, so there was no prospect of that for me, and when my father died, all he left us was debt. Debt that was to be paid to some deeply shady characters. The first time they beat me in an attempt to prompt my mother into paying, I was 14 and I didn't understand it. I understood the pain, all right. I was in bed for a week afterwards, nursing a broken wrist, cracked ribs, and severe cuts and bruises. What I didn't understand was how she could give them what she didn't have. How could they expect her to? Why was she responsible for the debts my father had amassed? It didn't seem fair, because it wasn't. On top of the physical pain of the whole thing, there was the worry. Worry that it might happen again, that next time they might not stop at a beating, or worse, that it might not be me who was the victim. When they finished beating me that time, when I was lying curled in the fetal position on the sidewalk, a shrill voice from somewhere above told me that I should consider myself lucky. That usually, Marco got one of his workers to do this sort of stuff, and that I was privileged to have received the beating from him personally. I was not grateful, particularly as it was a service I was expected to pay for. For taking the trouble to kick me senseless personally, Marco added 10% to our debt. My mother and I never discussed the things she had to do to get that money, though we both know what they were. All I can say is that by the time my wounds had healed, my mother had a lot of new bruises and wounds, some visible, some not. She also had enough cash to pay the debt. She told me one night after work. I had been sitting at the table removing the stitches our neighbour had inserted into the gash above my eyebrow. Nobody had the money for hospitals, but Tina had been a nurse in a previous life and did a fair job. The wound was hardly scarring at all. Mother had come home, placed her purse beside the water bowl tinged a rusty brown red with blood, and sighed deeply. "I have what we owe," she said, as if either of us actually owed the bastard anything, before adding in a muted half-whisper, "It's finished." I had expected that to be it. The last time she would ever need to do it, the last time she would leave at 9 p.m. and not come back till 3, the last time I would hear her groaning with pain as she moved or quietly sobbed downstairs. And yet, the night after she paid Marco, after she handed over the stack of notes she had collected for months in a cigar box she kept under the loose floorboard, and placed them into his hands, the same hands he had used to beat me senseless weeks earlier. Still, she went out. I didn't understand it. What need was there now? One night, I confronted her about it and tried to explain that she could stop now, that we had paid Marco and it was over. My mother simply smiled, and sweeping back my hair from my eyes, revealing as she did so the scar above them, she shook her head. "I still need money for Charco," she said, still smiling. "I paid off your father's debts, but I haven't given Marco what I owe him. But he'll get it soon enough. In time, they all get what's owed." A week later, my mother came home at 5, hours later than usual. Unbeknownst to her, I had made a habit of getting up around 10 minutes to 3 so as to be awake when she came home. I wanted to know that she was back and safe. When she hadn't returned by 4:30 a.m., I began to panic. Eventually, though, I did hear the key in the lock, and while lying in bed, I silently listened for her footsteps entering the hallway and the sound of her shoes on the hard surface of the torn linoleum floor. Instead of those sounds, however, instead of waiting downstairs, trying to clear her head and force the night's memories out before she attempted to sleep, or sobbing quietly as she so often did, I heard her come straight up the stairs, hurriedly, almost as if she were in a panic to get there, and with little concern about the noise it made or the possibility of waking me, something she usually avoided at all costs, though, of course, I was often only pretending to be asleep. At first, I thought she was going to burst into my room and scold me for still being awake that night, but instead, she turned right and headed directly for the bathroom and began filling the bath. Worried that perhaps she had been hurt, or that something had happened to her that made her want to scrub her skin till it glowed red as she had a few weeks before, I lifted myself out of bed and on tiptoed feet slowly crossed the hallway from my room, dodging carefully around the boards that I knew would squeak and give away my movements. I was determined to investigate. What I found was my mother, fully dressed, kneeling and slumped halfway over the side of the bathtub, as if she were bathing an infant or testing the water before she got in. Tears were tumbling gently down her cheeks, and yet she was smiling, caressing the surface of the water with a dreamy, wistful motion, as if lost in a world entirely removed from our own. Eventually, taken aback by this strange scene, I took a misstep. The floorboard creaked loudly, and all at once the dream was shattered. My mother turned to where I was standing and fixed her eyes on me. She scolded me for being out of bed at this hour, telling me to get back to my room and go to sleep. When I attempted to ask what she was doing, her voice went up another octave, and I instantly thought better of inquiring. Instead, I did return to my room, but I did not sleep. Rather, I lay awake wondering why my mother had placed what looked to me like mud and dead leaves on the surface of the water, and a small male Barbie doll into the bottom of the bath. Why she caressed that doll ever so softly, and why the entire scene made my blood run cold. The following morning, I heard from a friend that Marco, local kingpin, and my personal tormentor, was dead. It seemed his expensive sports car had somehow spun out of control on a high bend and, crashing through the barrier, had careened headlong into the river. For months after, the local kids would talk about the scene, each claiming to have been or to have known an eyewitness, the lurid details becoming more and more graphic and exaggerated with every retelling. In every version, however, they would tell how Marco's girlfriend, killed by the impact, was slumped to one side in the front seat as the bonnet and front wheels began to disappear below the surface. They told how, in desperation, Marco had climbed into the back seat, thrusting and pounding his fists against the back window until they bled, how he screamed his muffled, unheard cries, trying in vain to escape. One telling, I remember vividly, seemed to concentrate solely on the whites of Marco's eyes, how they bulged and widened as water began to flood in, and the icy, sediment stink of river water swirled around his thighs, his hips, his chest, and the car, with slow, sucking inevitability, started to sink beneath the water. I remember how hearing this story would make my breathing quicken and my chest tighten, as if I too were drowning. Some less believable accounts said that he even shot at the glass in an attempt to shatter it. Some that he succeeded and was clawing his way out, his chest and stomach sliced to pieces by the glass when the car finally pulled him under. Whatever he attempted in reality, it was no good. The car went under with him still inside. Marco drowned before anyone could reach him, his body resting at the bottom of the muddy lake, whilst on the surface dead leaves floated, unconcerned. That night, Mother didn't go out. In fact, she never went for that kind of work again. Later, when I was alone in the house, I crept into her room and, removing the floorboards, checked the cigar box where she kept her cash. It was empty of money, but in place of the notes, there was a feather, richly black. It was sticky and caked with some sort of liquid at one end. In addition, there were a tiny bottle of rum, a plastic ziplock in which a quantity of dirt and leaves had been placed, and, perhaps, most horrifically, what looked to me like a preserved alligator's foot. When I brought up the topic of Marco's death a few days later, she gave me a strange, sideways look, partly of suspicion, and partly, I thought, of sorrow or anger. Whatever it was as cold and hard as I ever saw my mother's face, usually so full of warmth and light. Speaking on the subject, she said extraordinarily little, except that Marco had finally gotten what was owed. It was then that I began to suspect two things. Firstly, that my mother would never speak on this topic again, and secondly, that the old woman we called Chaco had far more ready cash than she had at the start of the week. Unfortunately, she was the only one with money, and Marco the only one getting what was owed. Over the next few years, it seemed there wasn't a bill paid on time, a neighbour we didn't owe money to, or a bank that would give us credit. My mother worked, one job at the convenience store and the other at night as a cleaner, but even those 2 wages combined were not enough. Especially because every time one of those pay packets came in, part of it went under the floorboards. At first into the cigar box, then 2 boxes, and finally into a suitcase. Money placed beneath the boards never came out again. Not for rent, not for bills, not even for food, and God knows we could have used it a few times when the 3rd day of soup wasn't filling our bellies. Still, the money was never touched. That, we both knew, was my college fund, saved over years, and still, it wasn't enough. But it helped. With a scholarship, hardship bursary, and the money I had saved myself, I had just enough to pay tuition fees for my 3-year course. For everything else, I needed a job. Mother's health deteriorated a good deal during my last years at high school, and by the time I graduated she wasn't able to work anymore. So it was that, aged 16 on my first day legally allowed to work, I started my job at the burger joint, putting up with the shitty conditions and abusive customers in exchange for a check that would buy food, books, and pay at least some of the rent. And though I hated the work itself, I had to say that to some extent I felt grateful. I had a job, a steady wage, and the prospect, however dim, of a better life once I graduated. Plus, the job wasn't so bad. Until, that is, the day that Malcolm arrived. Then things took a nosedive, and fast. One of the few things they don't tell you in the interview for most burger joints is that your duties will extend far beyond salting fries, taking orders, and the obligatory flipping of burgers. They never mention the fact that most burger joints have a public toilet and that the franchise owners have no intention of paying additional cleaning staff to deal with the mess made by the general public. To this day, I have always thought there was at least a faint tinge of racism in the way these jobs were allocated. It seemed there was never a shift I worked during which I wouldn't at some point have my hand down a toilet scrubbing. It was unpleasant work, I won't lie, and at least once I butted heads with management over their wish for me to pick up and dispose of the used needles that were often left in there without protective equipment. It was the most vocal I had ever been in opposition to management, and for almost 2 weeks I was terrified that they might terminate my contract. Eventually, though, they returned with protective gloves and a sharps kit. It really was the tiniest of small victories. I now had the right protection, but it was still my name that invariably appeared on the roster to do the job, more so since I spoke up. That isn't even to mention the revolting aspects of the job. Why grown men and women would sometimes feel the need to spread shit over the walls of the cubicles like some cross between a dirty protest and a Jackson Pollock painting was beyond me. Sometimes people would make the decision to lay whatever they had to directly next to the toilet itself, as if they preferred to crap straight onto the floor than to sully themselves by using a toilet seat someone else had peed on. And of course it would be my job to clean away whatever they deposited. My least favourite part, though, was the trough. Though the toilets had a single urinal on the far wall, the gents also had a trough, a long stainless steel surface to pee against, below which was a catchment area, a gutter with a plug hole at one end. What annoyed me most about cleaning this part of the toilet was the gum. For some reason, it was the habit of many men to dispose of their chewing gum by spitting it directly into this gutter, often allowing it either to drift on the small stream of urine and water down to the plug hole, or actually take the time to amuse themselves by using the pressure of their own stream to pee the wad of gum down to the other end, like it was some kind of Olympic sport. What never seemed to occur to these urinal athletes was that the plug at the end had a grate over it. Their gum was never, ever going to simply fall down the pipe and be flushed away. Rather, it would come to rest in that grate and would remain there, accumulating and sticking to the other piss-soaked masses of gum until a filthy, globulous pile built up. This pile would have to be removed regularly, or else it would block the flow of water into the hole and cause the trough to overflow. Removed, that is, by hand. And so it was that every day of my working life, whilst employed under the auspices of that particular burger chain, I would enter the gents' toilets and, after mopping and sometimes chipping away whatever delights the creative customers had left for me in the stalls, would then have to fish out various cuds of chewing gum from the small river of piss. The worst aspect of this job was the actual touching of the gum. The slippery sheen of the wad as multiple pieces, often in various colours and retaining some ghost of their flavoured scent, balled together, and beneath the pressure of the fingers would leak some form of juice onto the hands. It was enough to make me retch. So, as you can imagine, I was less than impressed when one afternoon, whilst fishing a particularly large mass of gum from the trough, I turned to find a red-haired man in an expensive-looking suede jacket standing there and watching me. He had entered the toilets despite the sign explaining that they were closed for cleaning, and seemed to be observing with some fascination the process of gum removal. From my position, kneeling next to the trough, I explained that the toilets were closed for the time being, but that I would only be a few more minutes. In response to this, the man smiled a weird, crooked smile and winked at me. Then he calmly walked up to the other end of the trough, took out his manhood, and proceeded to relieve himself into it. I eyed him cautiously, wondering whether he might be hard of hearing or perhaps of understanding, and with the ball of gum still in my hand rose to my feet and dumped it into the black bag, shaking my head. Then it happened. Without taking his eyes off me, the man slowly and deliberately spat his gum into the trough and then proceeded to pee it along to the end where I was standing. Again, winking as he did up his zip, he nodded toward where it had come to rest before adding finally, "You missed a piece," and grinning broadly. It was a small thing. Liberty and an insult, no doubt, but not so offensive that I should have swung for him there and then, but by God I wanted to. I wanted to run across and slap the smile right off his face, so hard that it stuck to the wall opposite. Instead, I simply reached into the trough and picked out the offending piece of gum. "You think that's clever, do you?" I asked in my best condescending voice, though at my age and having just been forced by my station in life to fish a man's deliberately spat gum out of his piss, it seemed a little hollow. "I think it's your fucking job and that you should shut up and get on with it," he said, still smirking and turning toward the door. Oh, how I wanted to hit him. As it turned out, that would have been an awfully bad idea, for when I went downstairs a few minutes later and, having disposed of the bags and thoroughly washed my hands, returned to my shift, I was introduced to the same smirking face that I had wished so hard to have punched. Malcolm Peters was my new manager. I don't know if it was intended as hazing, some form of initiation ritual, or punishment for having talked back, but for the 6 hours that remained of my shift, Malcolm Peters made my life hell. He gave me every filthy, disgusting job he could come up with, cleaning sections of machinery and unseen corners of the restaurant and its surroundings that hadn't been touched in years. At one point he had me standing inside the dumpster with a spray bottle and a small scrubbing brush, cleaning out the inside because he claimed it was unhygienic to have a dirty dumpster within 200 yards of the restaurant, even though the trash cans were kept in an entirely separate area. During the shift, I said nothing. I kept my cool because I needed to keep my job. As I left that night, however, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the chunk of piss-drenched gum I had fished from the urinal and retained for the purpose, and without a moment's hesitation, quietly spread it all over the back of Malcolm's suede jacket, hanging on a hook in the corridor. Believe it or not, for a day or so, I felt bad about that. By the end of the week, I didn't. That Friday, at the start of my shift, Malcolm called me into his office. He asked me to take a seat, and after some excruciating chit-chat, he asked me where I was really from. When I replied that I was American, he simply laughed. A weird, scoffing laugh that was half amusement and half spitting, but which confirmed to me instantly that he suspected me of ruining his coat. On the desk in front of him, he had placed a small brown paper folder that I instantly recognized as my file with the company, on account of my name being printed in the top corner. Without saying anything else, he lifted a sheet of paper from the folder and, examining it, said, "You live with your mother, right?" I nodded, and he mirrored the nod, pursing his lips in a strange, duck-like expression somewhere between consideration and disgust. "And where is she really from?" he asked, placing down the page and looking me directly in the eye. I didn't respond, which was fortunate, as Malcolm clearly had more to say. "Because," he went on, "it's worth remembering that I have your file, so I have your home address, and if the authorities happened to ask, then I would have to tell them where you and your mum lived. You know, just in case they wanted to check her paperwork and make sure that wasn't one of those illegals in the country without permission. Now, I'm not saying that I would call them myself, although obviously I could if I was worried, just that if they did happen to ask, well, I'd have to tell them, wouldn't I? Then your mom would be sent back to whatever dark corner of the earth it is that she came from." He again smiled at this, though I did not see anything amusing about the situation. I rose from the chair and made my way to the door. "Just bear it in mind, son," added Malcolm with a laugh. "And by the way, you're on toilet duty first thing, so you'd better grab a mop." I left the room without a word. I had been threatened before. I knew that most times people didn't have the nerve to follow through with what they said, but I also knew that Malcolm was just the type of asshole who would. Whether it was racism, an instant dislike, or some odd notion of vengeance that motivated him, I wasn't sure. What I did know was that I needed to look for another job, and quick. In the meantime, the less I had to do with Malcolm Peters, the better. I decided that I would ask to be transferred to another shift pattern, shifts when another manager was supervising, and the two of us would not cross paths. Whilst I looked for another job, I intended to avoid the man as much as possible, to keep our little tit-for-tat game at a stalemate so that nobody would get hurt. Unfortunately, Malcolm took that decision out of my hands. When I arrived home that evening, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table sobbing. Despite it being mid-March, she had a woolen hat pulled down over her ears. I rushed to her side and asked her what the matter was, terrified that somehow someone had figured out a connection between her and Marco, that someone had hurt or threatened her. For a moment I wondered if Malcolm had decided to call the authorities after all. It was true that he did know my address. As it turned out, Malcolm had used that information, but in a vastly different way. Around 9 o'clock, whilst I was still working and long after my manager to mentor had left for the night, my mother had received a knock at the door. Opening it cautiously, she had been confronted by what she described as a middle-aged white man with red hair. The man said nothing, but with a single action reached forward and slapped my mother on the top of her head before turning and calmly walking away. Too shocked to even react, my mother had recoiled and slammed the door shut. It was only a few moments later that she realized what he had done. In striking my mother on the top of her head, the man had pushed into her dreadlocked hair a large deposit of chewing gum. The gum had tangled in the locks, stretching and knotting into the hair, sticking and matting several locks together. My mother had screamed and tried to pull the gum out, but it had been no use. A few hours later, seeing no other option, my mother visited our neighbour Tina, and she had the dreadlocks she had been growing for almost 15 years cut from her head, and the remaining hair shaved down, so that now she was completely bald. Removing her hat at the kitchen table, she showed me the results of the attack and shuddered to tell me that every time she had looked into the mirror, she saw the bastard smirking. I was incandescent. I swore that the next day I would walk into work and beat the son of a bitch to death with my bare hands. As I raged, however, my mother simply sat quietly shaking her head. "Sometimes," she said, once I had finally calmed down, "you must pay in money. Sometimes the satisfaction is enough. Our community looks after its own. You will go to work tomorrow, but you will say nothing. There are other ways." From her pocket, she took a small Ziploc bag in which were the locks that had been shorn from her head, each one still intact, twisted together by the gum so that they rested inside the plastic like some giant black spider. "To make things happen," she said with a sigh, "you need something of theirs. Skin, hair, a piece of their clothing, saliva." She turned and looked at me with a hollow, empty hardness in her eyes that I had only seen once before. "It works like this," she said, placing the hair on the table so that it rested between us like a physical manifestation of the problem. "Once you have got something of theirs, you give it to Charco. She then gives you 2 objects. All of that nonsense you see in the films about voodoo dolls is just rubbish. What she gives you can be anything: an egg, a mango, a piece of wood, anything. The point is, you must do things correctly." I nodded, knowing all the while that doing things correctly would make me complicit in something that was likely to have dire consequences, just as I knew that my mother had no papers and that a single phone call would send her back to a place where she would likely be killed within weeks. I nodded a single gesture that showed both agreement and consent. My mother went on quietly. "When she gives you these 2 things, one must be given to the subject, put into their possession somehow so that it then belongs to them. Once that is done, whatever you do to the other will happen to them. Give them 1 egg and go home to fry the other. Give them a mango and go home to stamp on the other. As surely as the sun rises, they will be burnt or crushed." Years later, my mother would tell me how she paid half of the money she saved to Chaco, the other half to a local girl whom she paid to slip a doll into the boot of Marco's car. Sitting at the kitchen table that night, she said she would see Chaco in the morning, and that by afternoon I would know what to do. By the end of the week, Malcolm Peters was dead. The papers said it was a freak accident, that in the past 50 years only 4 people had died in the United States in accidents involving escalators, still fewer in the horrific manner Malcolm had. It seems he had fallen through a faulty panel at the top of the mechanical stairs and was pulled by his legs into the machinery, his body, mangled flesh, minced beyond recognition. There was nothing anyone could do, and though an investigation into the company manufacturing the escalator would obviously take place, it was really nobody's fault. No one but mine, my mother's, and Chaco's. For I couldn't help but feel it was more than a coincidence that the strange old woman who lived in our community and gave tonics for illnesses and prayed to strange gods should give me so specific an instruction only days earlier. Having received the bag with my mother's hair and the gum chewed by Malcolm, she had in turn given me 2 brand new sticks of gum. 1 piece, she told me, to slip into Malcolm's coat, the other to do with as I pleased. Later that day, I put the gum into Malcolm's pocket, whilst the other piece I chewed for hours. The park at midnight. Honestly, until the thing with Stephen Meller, I'd never understood how people managed to be scared of ghosts. Monsters I could understand, serial killers even more so. Monsters like werewolves and vampires had huge tearing teeth and ripping claws, whilst serial killers, even fictional ones, thrust with their horribly pointed kitchen knives or smacked their lips at the thought of devouring you. I could even understand people feeling creeped out by aliens and the kind of mutant creatures and robots you see in sci-fi. To me, being scared of all that stuff made sense. But ghosts? Perhaps it was the tangibility of the others, the idea that monsters and aliens, if real, could actually do you harm in the physical world, that they were in some way more solid and physically threatening in a literal, touchable way. I could understand being scared of that, but bedsheets going woo like a boiling kettle, or ghoulies and dead people creeping around in churchyards on tiptoe just didn't cut the mustard. When I heard reports of plates and furniture flying around, I assumed it was a domestic, not a poltergeist. Christ knows my wife has thrown some crockery in her time. When something went bump in the night, I assumed it was either a burglar or some local pisshead too drunk to get his key in the door. Now, I'm not saying I'm impervious. I'm happy to admit that if I were ever to come face to face with someone I knew to be dead, up and walking about, it would likely give me a bit of a start. I would be scared because it was happening to me. Things are always different in person. What I could never get my head around was how people got scared of ghosts on the page, or in films, the same way they did other stuff. Even when I heard the spooky stories the other fellas told, and trust me, every copper has a few, I was just never moved. Until it came to Stephen. In some ways, I suppose the job might have numbed me. As a police officer for over 30 years, I had seen my fair share of horrible things. The ugly side of humanity was laid bare for me daily. I had also, I'm sorry to say, seen my fair share of dead bodies. All of them stiff, inanimate, and although sobering in a remember your fate kind of way, no more terrifying than the kitchen table or any other hard, unmoving thing. Whatever it was, the thing with Stephen cut through that numbness like a red-hot poker. Now I am scared of ghosts. Not only because I know they're real, but more importantly, because I know what they can do. I had known of Stephen for almost a decade. Though we worked on the same force and had a nodding acquaintance, we had never actually been in the same department or even on similar shifts until about a year before it happened. When we finally did end up working together, me as a sergeant, him as a detective constable working under my supervision, I found him to be an amiable and straight-talking kind of bloke. He was also a bloody good copper. Or so I thought. So it was with some surprise that I met the question he posed to me one October morning about securing a restraining order. He had asked to see me the day before, but my schedule had been full, so I'd penciled him in for the following morning. When he arrived at the office, his usual awkwardly pleasant grin was missing, and there was something in the way his eyes never stayed still that made me nervous. There was something in the furtive, restless glances as if searching the shadows of the room, expecting at every moment someone or something to jump out at him, that was deeply unsettling. Not at this point because I was afraid for myself, but because I was naturally concerned for one of my officers. I had seen changes like this in people before. Officers who usually came in whistling a happy tune grown suddenly morose, often due to the demands of the job. The things we see, whilst they don't always impact us immediately, take their toll. My own captain explained it to me years ago as being like snow. A single snowflake falling on a branch is almost imperceptible, but pile enough of those flakes, make a thick, accumulated pile of snow, and eventually the branch will snap under the weight. Even before Stephen spoke, I was already going through my mental Rolodex searching for the names of therapists I might refer him to. What he actually asked, however, threw me totally off balance. I wanted to ask Sarge, how do you go about getting a restraining order? The question struck me as odd. Firstly, because I assumed that as a long-serving officer he would already know the answer, or at least know how to ask about it other than his immediate superior. Secondly, because of the other details he shared, I suppose it was at that point that I began to suspect that all was not well with Stephen Mellor. There was something unnervingly calculated about the way he steered the conversation. In the course of our 20-minute chat, he seemed very keen to repeat certain points, labouring them almost to the point of excess, as if trying to ensure that I remembered them later. I had interviewed enough perps to spot someone trying to signpost their way through a story, leaving obvious breadcrumbs, building alibis, and littering their statements with key phrases their lawyer had instructed them to include and ensure that they got on record. It's hard to explain, but for a long-time copper, the experience is like dancing with someone and have them fight you to take the lead, as if they are struggling to guide and steer you in certain premeditated directions. That conversation with Stephen felt the same, as if there was some blueprint he was working to. I noticed this, and although I didn't say anything about it at the time, I knew that I didn't like it. According to him, for the last month he had been receiving phone calls from a woman named Donna Lambert, a woman I had heard of previously owing to her ridiculous insistence that she was a medium or psychic, and credulity was given to her so-called abilities by some of my colleagues. Around the division, Miss Lambert was somewhere between an urban myth and a joke. On several occasions, she had called the front desk with what she described as pertinent information about ongoing cases. At first, she was dismissed as a crank to be filed away alongside the scores of other nut jobs who call in every full moon, confessing to all manner of non-existent crimes. For a time, she was humoured but politely ignored. Until she started to be right. Dozens of coppers working in our neck of the woods would swear on their children's lives that Mad Donna had helped them with a case, either by giving them a steer in the right direction or, some cases, by identifying the guilty party and pointing the way to evidence that would help to convict them. Obviously, like all policemen's stories, the tales got embellished, and by the time they were recounted in the local pub, Madame Lambert the Extraordinary was staring into a crystal ball and giving the home address of Jack the Ripper, but no doubt there was a grain of truth to the stories. Hearing Miss Lambert's name in this context was highly surprising. According to Stephen, Mad Donna had been calling him twice a night for the past month. She had even called the mobile phone given him for duty, the number for which he had not shared with anyone outside of the department, and which he had no idea how she had obtained. "Maybe she's psychic," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Stephen didn't laugh. Instead, he simply continued with his complaint, reeling off occasions and inconvenient moments at which Mad Donna had called him and revealing how his wife was becoming increasingly agitated about it. Even whilst revealing these details, however, Stephen seemed somehow off, and again my policeman's spider sense began to tingle. Whenever a natural link in a chain is omitted by someone making a statement, that link immediately stands out as important. In Stephen's case, I instantly noticed that although he complained of the times and frequency of these calls, he never disclosed what they were actually about, or even a single word of what was said. I decided not to press this, gave Stephen some advice on how to go about taking the measures he wished to take, and advised him that he would need to show some reason and indeed evidence to justify a restraining order. We shared pleasantries, and he left. Within an hour, I began my own inquiries. Martin Doc Doherty had been a colleague and close personal friend of mine for many years. He also happened to be the shift supervisor for one Stephen Mellor. Later that same day, I asked Doc to come see me so I could find out a little more about Stephen and what was going on. As soon as the name left my lips, there was an acknowledgement from Doc in the form of a heavy sigh and a weary shake of his head. "There's something not right with that lad," was his immediate response. "He's been getting these phone calls from that psychic lady, you know." I nodded that I had heard as much, and Doc went on. "Never mentions what they're about, though, does he?" he said, with a level of perceptiveness that made me smile internally, though I maintained a straight face. "No, seems a bit odd, doesn't it?" I replied. Doc nodded, and closing the door of the office behind him, ensuring that he couldn't be heard, took a seat opposite me at my desk. "Thing is, Sarge, Stephen's been a bit off these past few weeks. I spoke to his wife not a fortnight ago and just happened to ask her what the phone calls were about. Apparently, she had overheard a few of them with some woman, that's the way she described it, some woman screaming down the phone and saying over and over that he knows and that Stephen needed to confess. At first, she blushed to admit this, mind you, but at first she thought it was an affair, that he was some disgruntled partner and that Stephen was being urged to confess to her, but then he had explained who exactly was calling. Apparently, it was doing their marriage no good at all. I nodded at this, but decided that I needed to press Doc a little further. "So what is it that you think has been odd about him?" At this, Doc looked uncomfortable and squirmed a little in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck with his hand in the way he always did when he was nervous. "Well," he began cautiously, "a few weeks back there was a report that some youths were causing trouble on Landale Park. They were drinking and had apparently set one of the bins on fire. Stephen was asked to go up there and sort these idiots out, or at least tell them to get home, which he said he had. Problem is, when I checked the next day, Stephen hadn't actually gone up there at all. His car was seen on the other side of town, and more calls came in about these idiots. Well, at first I thought it was a mistake, so I asked one of his partners about it. Come to find out, Stephen never goes up there. Apparently, umpteen times there have been reports of things happening near that park, and on every occasion, Stephen has either ended up busy on another case, or just didn't turn up at all. The other coppers have been covering him for months, and they even make a joke about it, saying that he's scared of the ghosts." "Ghosts?" I asked, surprised, as Doc again gripped the back of his neck. "Yeah," he went on gingerly. "Apparently, when you go up to Landale Park late on, like midnight, sometimes there's a boy sitting on the swing." Doc followed this with a long pause, which I left empty, in order to encourage him to go on. "A few of my lads have mentioned it. They'd be doing a slow circuit around the estates and would drive past Landale Park. You know the place, it's basically a bit of rough ground and grass that the council have put a slide and a few swings upon." I nodded that I knew the place and indeed visualized it in my mind. The park was fringed with trees and marked the boundary between two overspill estates. On one side was a large open grass area where people tended to walk their dogs or play football on a Sunday, and closer to the tree line was a slide, an old metal roundabout, some monkey bars, and the swings that Doc was talking about. The swings themselves consisted of a metal frame, the swing seat suspended by thick metal chains that were freezing to hold in winter, whilst the seat was essentially a sling of hard black plastic. I had driven by the place many times, but I had never seen a boy, nor could I see at this point how the story linked back to Stephen. Doc went on. "A few times folks have ridden out there and, well, they've seen a boy." "A boy?" I asked, wondering where this was going and wondering for a moment whether Doc might be pulling my leg. One look at his face, however, and I knew immediately that there was no humour in his words. His face had gone a peculiar ashen grey, as if with each word he spoke, another degree of the colour that usually warmed his complexion escaped through his mouth with it. His voice, too, had lost its usual assertive push, and now seemed thin and somehow forced, as if he were having great trouble even approaching the subject. At first, he just nodded, then, realizing I needed more to go on, pressed his throat into action. "Yes, sir," he finally muttered quietly. "A boy just sat there, on the swing. Everything else is pitch black. Obviously it's the middle of the night and there's nobody else about except this boy. Sometimes it's just a silhouette, just the shape of a boy sitting there, swinging backward and forwards. Most times, though, he's still, just sitting there, his legs dangling and not even moving, even in the middle of winter, and you know how cold it gets up here, but he never moves. Anyway,
A few of my gang have even gone so far as to get out of the car and walk over to him, to find out what the matter was and what the hell was doing out on his own at that time in the morning. But he hesitated to swallow deeply. When they got closer, the boy had just gone. Gone, I echoed. Doc nodded, and I could see from the tightening purse of his lips that the topic was making him feel uncomfortable. He and I had been friends for a long time. He was a man I both liked and respected, and in the many years I'd worked alongside him, he had never struck me as anything other than the straightest of arrows. Now he was sitting in front of me telling stories about vanishing boys. Sensing my incredulity, he attempted to add weight to his statements. "I've got actual reports about it," he clarified desperately. "Coppers I know well who've thought it best to write up the story just in case a boy was missing or run away from home or whatever. They've actually written it, in black and white, that they got out and walked over, and the next thing they knew, where they thought the boy had been, there was nothing. Just a dark space, a shadow that was always there. One fella said it was as if the boy just, melted into the shadow like he was part of it. Gave me the bleeding creeps, I don't mind telling you. One thing I can say, though, is that people take it seriously. It's not a joke to them." I leaned back in my chair and sighed, still reeling from the revelation that officers at my division, my officers, were taking the time to write about ghost stories and mirages. "So, what does this have to do with Stephen?" I asked, though I could already fit the pieces together and make a fairly good guess at the response. "Well, it turns out our brave Officer Mellor isn't too keen to go on calls that involve going to that park. In fact, he's never gone to one. Ever. Obviously, the others have got on his case about it, but he'll never say anything. I knew nothing about this because even though they didn't like it, the others covered for him. It was only when some local idiots set the park bin on fire again that it even came to my attention. Mellor was supposed to go up there and speak to the lads who did it, but instead he just decided not to go. I got a complaint through from the fire brigade because they turned up expecting there to be police support and there was none. Turns out Mellor was still downstairs at his desk working on something else." I nodded and decided that first thing in the morning I was to have a rather extended chat with Officer Mellor. As it turned out, I never got the chance. What I did get the chance to do, however, was ride up to Lansdale Park on my way home. It was around 10 minutes out of my way, but I decided that I needed to see for myself what had put the willies up my best officer. It was around midnight when I got there. I'd clocked out at 11, run quickly to the all-night supermarket to pick up a few things, and as I was loading them into the car, decided that it might be worth swinging by. Even before I parked the car, I could see that the park was empty. The swings remained perfectly still, undisturbed even by the breeze. There is, I can happily admit, something unnerving about places that usually buzz with life when that life is removed. Look at a theme park at night or a front room scattered with toys but no children, and you see more than just the objects. There is an absence there, an emptiness or stasis. It's as if those places with the vitality removed become themselves like corpses, dead, inanimate remnants like bones or an empty shell, relics of where life once was. I'll admit those places are eerie, and on that night, having heard what I'd heard, the park was no different. In the moonlight, the grass looked almost blue, drained like the equipment of its colour and lifeblood. The equipment, a slide, a roundabout, seesaw, monkey bars, and the swing, stood undisturbed and silhouetted, their shapes and frames protruding from the ground like metal carcasses or the weird industrial ornaments we grew to replace the trees. Putting on my hat and leaving the car, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The park, which stood opposite the general store that served the local estate, was a popular spot next to a relatively busy road. It was fringed on two sides by woods, but on the other, at a distance, by the gardens and fences of local houses. Never, in all of the times I had passed this place, had I ever seen it so still.
Yes, the hour was late, and generally there weren't many people on the streets at this time of night, but this was different. The sound of the car door closing, not slamming, you understand, rang across the area like a clap of thunder. It echoed and reverberated into the silence like it was the first sound heard there in days. I half expected its scream to have woken the residents, but nothing, and no one stirred. Not a light shone in a window, not a dog barked, no babies cried. I saw no cats streaking across the road in half-seen flashes. Everything was a hush. Stepping onto the grass, I heard no footsteps, no traffic, no sound from the houses nearby, and considering this, I stupidly allowed the sentence to form in my mind. There seemed to be not a soul around. I let the words percolate in my mind, then admonished myself for allowing them to make me feel uneasy. "Don't be stupid," I told myself aloud, shaking my head and making the short walk toward the apparatus, but my self-scolding didn't work. Slowly, glancing at intervals between the tree line, the roundabout, and eventually the swings, I realized all at once that I was unnerved. Not only that, but looking for someone. Actively surveying the area with the expectation of finding someone there. A boy, a man, someone. Yet, as I should have expected, there was only the darkness, the dry blue blades of the grass, and the cold rigidity of the steel equipment, unused and standing like strange monoliths in a curious, uneasy arrangement. For a second, looking at these odd shapes, I considered what societies in a few millennia would make of them, were they to uncover them as we had Stonehenge or the pyramids. What meaning would they ascribe to the swings with their thick chains and plastic seat, the monkey bars like a strange H-shaped sculpture or a horizontal ladder? What significance would they see in the slide that allows the user to climb toward heaven, but inevitably always slide back to earth, or perhaps somewhere below? It was as I considered these ideas, my eyes still scanning the lines and glimmers of the metal, that for the first time since I left the car, I heard a sound around me. It had come from the tree line, the dark wall of knitted branches directly behind the swings. It was distinct, not the breaking of a branch or the fluttering of some bird disturbed from its roost. Rather, it was a soft rustling, as of bushes and leaves disturbed by something heavier than wind, something with presence, weight, and form that had pressed against them and left them to swing back into place. I watched the space and the swings themselves, the steel chain, the hard plastic seat. Nothing. Heading back to the car, I again told myself off for being so stupid, for allowing myself to be influenced by the superstitions of others, and even worse, for allowing them to actually get to me. I had just slipped my key into the lock, promising myself that I would never tell anyone that I came here, when my eyes caught sight of a shape in the wing mirror. In it, I saw a distorted view of the park, the tree line like a streak of pink, the grass a crayon scribble of differing lengths. I saw the slide, warped by the reflection, and to the left of the image, the swings, and the boy sitting upon them. I spun around in a fraction of a second and stared back at the park, at the point where the boy slumped slightly to the left, his head resting on one of the chains that supported the seat of the swing where he had been waiting, and saw nothing. Only the empty swing, moving ever so slightly. Stephen Mellor did not show for work the next day. The following evening, he was found by 2 other officers. He had hanged himself from the chains that support the swing on Lansdale Park. Whilst investigating the case, a number of strange details came to light that somewhat altered my view of so-called ghosts. Firstly, there was the way in which Stephen hanged himself. Unlike most wishing to take their own lives, who might take pills or use a gun if they could get hold of one, Stephen chose to hang, but not in the way that most would imagine. Rather than taking some jerking drop with a rope that would break his neck and kill him instantly, Stephen chose to hang of a different sort. Taking the chains from 2 sets of swings, he wound them together into some sort of strange plait, wrapped the end around his throat, and then proceeded to simply sit down. The cause of death was not a broken neck, but rather slow and agonizing strangulation, as the chains tightened and tightened, leaving his body hanging pendulously, slumped forward for 2 of my other officers to find. Then there were the hours before the act. Though he had not shown for work, Stephen drove to the hardware shop at the top of Entware Road. On the CCTV, he can be seen buying the bolt cutters he used to separate the swing seat from the chains. When I asked to speak to the attendant who served him, I was told that he had taken sick and was at home that day. Naturally, I went to the man's house to interview him there, and found a pale wreck of a man. He certainly remembered Stephen coming in and selling him the bolt cutters. What he remembered more distinctly, however, was Stephen's face. "It was so weird," he said, his hands trembling as he reached for his tea. "He had this hoodie on, and when he looked up, it was like he was a man, but his face was like a kid's, as a little boy's face, sort of put on top. Do you know what I mean? It was like on top." I didn't know what he meant, but God knows in the weeks since I have imagined it. From there, Stephen can be seen on several other CCTV cameras. He left his vehicle and walked in a strange, slow meander toward the park. Reaching the swings, he sat on them and indeed swung on them for almost 20 minutes before taking the bolt cutters to the chains, winding them around his neck and sitting heavily down. Oddly, the officers who found Stephen's body both reported that from the road they had assumed the shape to be the body of a child. One of them even went so far as to specify a small boy, and recounted how they became confused when they approached and found the shape to be a fully grown man. I have never believed in ghosts, nor have I ever believed in the idea of possession. Any time I had ever heard the word before, it was in relation to demons or evil spirits occupying people's bodies. I had never even considered the idea that a so-called ghost could take control of someone's body and make them do things in the real world. But then I called Donna. Her explanation of events was far-fetched and involved events and possibilities that I, as a police officer, refused to put down in any police report. As a man, however, as someone who has to pass that park every night on my way home, my opinion is slightly different. In the course of our conversation, Donna implored me to revisit the case of a hit-and-run incident from almost 3 years earlier, in which a young boy was killed on the road close to Lansdale Park. She asked me to consider the fact that a few days after that incident, Officer Meller reported his car stolen, and indeed the remnants of the vehicle, completely burnt out, were found on the croft behind Lansdale Park. She asked me to also consider the fact that in the incident, the small boy's hoodie became caught in the wheels, and as the guilty party attempted to speed away, the boy was dragged for several minutes behind the car by his throat. She also told me, cryptically, to check Stephen's body and look closely at his clothing. Something that, in a bluster of dismissal, I steadfastly refused to do, but later, whilst alone in the silence of the morgue, I quietly and reluctantly did. In every item of Meller's clothing, his jeans, his t-shirt, even his underwear, and the hoodie he had been wearing when he had visited the hardware shop, a clothing label had been sewn in the manner that one would sew a label for a child to identify their PE kit. On each label, the name Arnold had been scrawled in lowercase letters in a red marker pen. A few days later, I did open the file on that hit and run. I'm sure I don't have to tell you the victim's first name, or that, nowadays, I find myself to be very much afraid of ghosts. This has been Scary Story Collection, 5 short, scary stories, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.